Hey guys, tonight we're heading back further than kings, castles, or even countries, to a time when Britain wasn't even an island, and the people walking around weren't quite sure what planet they were on. Picture a frozen land scraped by glaciers, prowled by saber-toothed cats, and so utterly alien that if you stepped out of a time machine here, your biggest problem wouldn't be food or shelter. It'd be not dying in the first 5 minutes. You'd be cold, you'd be hunted, and you'd definitely smell worse than usual. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Around 900,000 years ago, Britain saw its first known visitors. These weren't settlers. Think more like cautious tourists. Ones armed with flint axes and zero patience for icy rivers. Archaeologists found signs of their visit in Happisburgh, Norfolk, where ancient footprints were preserved in estuary mud. Yep, actual fossilized footprints. But don't picture dainty Roman sandals or even muddy boots. These were bare, flat, wide feet, belonging to early humans trudging through the chill, probably scanning for mammoth steaks and somewhere dry to nap. But here's the catch. They didn't stick around. Britain, back then, was an on-again, off-again destination. Glaciers came and went like bad weather, turning the land into an unlivable freezer every few thousand years. People would try to settle, get scared off by the next ice age, and leave behind tools, bones, and the occasional jaw-dropping art carved into mammoth tusks. One of the oldest skulls ever found in Britain belonged to someone who lived around 500,000 years ago. Historians still argue whether they were Homo heidelbergensis or something even stranger. Either way, the dude lived a rough life. His skull had dents suggesting either clumsy accidents or very unfriendly neighbors. Fast forward to around 40,000 years ago, and Britain gets its first real starring role in human history. Neanderthals had already come and gone, probably freezing, starving, or awkwardly mating with early modern humans, and now Homo sapiens were arriving with cave art, better tools, and that signature flair for being just a little too ambitious. They weren't British, of course, no one was yet, but they were clever. They hunted in groups, used fire, and maybe, just maybe, had the beginnings of language. Still, they didn't last long either. Another ice age rolled in around 20,000 years ago and wiped the slate clean again. It wasn't until about 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last glacial maximum, that humans could finally settle down without needing to punch a woolly rhino for breakfast. By 10,000 BCE, the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age had arrived. The ice melted, the forests crept north, and the landscape started to look more like modern Britain. Minus the Tesco Express. These early Britons were hunter-gatherers, and they were surprisingly good at it. They moved with the seasons, harvested nuts and berries, fished rivers, and built temporary camps from wood and hide. Fringe fact, they may have practiced early forms of land management, like burning patches of forest to encourage new plant growth. It's a bit like prehistoric gardening, with more smoke and fewer gnomes. One of the best preserved settlements from this time is Starcar, in North Yorkshire. There, archaeologists found not just tools and animal bones, but decorative headdresses made from red deer skulls. Nobody's sure if they were religious garb, fashion statements, or just an excellent way to freak out the neighbors. As time went on, these people began to form tight-knit groups with distinct cultures. They buried their dead with care, sometimes in communal tombs, sometimes alone. They carved patterns into stone tools. They developed oral histories, most of which, tragically, didn't survive the wind and rain of the British Isles. But even now, their stories whisper through the land, in the shapes of ancient flint scatters, in post holes preserved under peat bogs, and in the DNA of modern Britons. And then, a huge shift. Not tectonic, but technological. Because all of this millennia of slow, quiet survival was just the warm-up, the real story of Britain would start when the ice melted for good. The seas began to rise, and humans, stubborn as ever, decided to build something permanent. But not before they lost a landmass. See, back then, Britain wasn't actually an island. It was still connected to mainland Europe, by a huge land bridge called Doggerland. That's right, our ancestors could literally walk from what's now Norfolk to the Netherlands, probably grumbling about the mud the whole way. And then it all sank. Sometime around 6200 BCE, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway triggered a tsunami that drowned Doggerland in a single terrifying day. A few thousand square miles of rich, fertile land just gone. Imagine being a Mesolithic fisherman and seeing your village swept away by waves taller than the trees. You probably wouldn't call it climate change, but you'd definitely call it a bad time. Still, humans adapted. They always do. The survivors retreated to higher ground, clung to the forests, and unbeknownst to them, became the first islanders in British history. And so begins the story of Britain. Not England, not yet. That's still thousands of years off. But the land was changing, and so were the people. Soon they'd stop wandering. They'd settle. They'd dig, plant, and build, and they'd leave behind clues that would take us centuries to decode. But more on that, after we finish scraping flint and watching out for short-tempered aurochs. As the last of the great glaciers retreated and Doggerland sank beneath the waves, the people who remained found themselves marooned, not by shipwreck, but by time itself. Britain was now an island, and that changed everything. No more walking to France for better weather or new flint. From here on out, anyone coming in had to really want it. The seas had risen, the climate had stabilized, and in this watery cradle, a new kind of life began to take shape. The land bridge was gone, but its memory lingered in the myths these people told. Themes of a lost world beneath the waves appear again and again in ancient stories. Historians still argue whether legends like Lyonesse or the Contraire Guallard flood myths are distorted memories of Doggerland's death. Maybe, maybe not, but you can't blame people for looking at the sea and imagining what lies underneath. And while the land changed shape, so did the people. They began to shift away from pure hunting and gathering. This wasn't an overnight switch. It took thousands of years, but gradually they began to settle, to plant, to raise animals. Farming was on its way, and with it came problems nobody in Britain had ever had to deal with before. Farming didn't just arrive magically one misty morning. It came in waves, likely brought by migrants from what is now the Balkans and Western Anatolia, sweeping across Europe over centuries. By around 4000 BCE, agriculture finally reached Britain, and it wasn't subtle. Imagine being a local forager, doing your usual thing, harvesting hazelnuts, fishing with bone hooks, stalking deer through the woods, and suddenly someone moves in next door with sheep, barley, and the very loud opinion that everything should be fenced. Early farmers cleared forest for fields, sometimes using fire, sometimes just relentless chopping. They built permanent homes, dug ditches, and most importantly, they started to build ownership. No more moving with the season. Now people had boundaries, food stores, and probably awkward conversations about who stole whose cow. Fringe detail, they also built causewayed enclosures, circular spaces dug into the land, ringed by ditches and banks. We still don't know exactly what they were for. Not houses, not forts, maybe ritual, markets, ancient music festivals with less hygiene. Whatever the truth, they suggest a society that was suddenly more complex, more social, and perhaps a little more tense. Because farming didn't come with peace and harmony. With it came disputes, disease, and inequality. When you have fields, you can have failure, and when you have livestock, you also have raiders. The bones of early farmers show more signs of injury and nutritional stress than their foraging ancestors. So yes, Neolithic life had more bread, but also more back pain and burglary. One curious change is in how the dead were treated. Earlier people buried their dead simply, sometimes in rivers, sometimes in shallow pits. But these new farmers, they built tombs, giant ones. Some were long barrows, huge earthen mounds with internal chambers, like West Kennet in Wiltshire. Others used massive standing stones to mark burial places. These weren't just graves, they were statements, and not just about death. They were about power. The people buried inside weren't just anyone, they were important. Maybe clan founders, maybe spiritual leaders, whoever they were, they mattered enough that entire communities spent weeks or months building monuments for them, out of stone, dragged from miles away. This was the first flicker of social hierarchy. The age of egalitarian foragers was ending. What's fascinating is that this new society didn't replace the old overnight. For centuries, farmers and foragers coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. There's evidence of hybrid sites, where fishing tools sit alongside grinding stones. It's like two worlds colliding, one tied to the seasons, the other to the soil. Eventually, farming won out, but not without struggle. And through all of this, the land itself responded. Forests thinned, wetlands expanded as fields eroded. The first signs of man-made landscape modification appeared. This was the dawn of what we now call the Anthropocene. Humans beginning to leave permanent marks on Earth's surface. Not skyscrapers or factories, just small clearings, ditches, and strangely straight rows of wheat. Historians still debate whether these early Neolithic societies were peaceful or violent. The truth is, they were probably both. There are fortified sites, there are massacre pits. There are also beautifully crafted axes and pottery decorated with spirals and dots that suggest someone had time to think about aesthetics, not just survival. And then there's the skull cults. Yeah, that's a real thing. At some sites, human skulls were collected, sometimes even modified, drilled with holes, set in niches, or placed in deliberate patterns. Were they trophies, ancestor shrines? A really unsettling version of interior design. We don't know, but clearly the Neolithic mind was capable of abstract, sometimes macabre, thought. All this happened in less than 1,000 years. Britain was transforming socially, spiritually, and ecologically, and the land began to fill with monuments. Long barrows, cursus, earthworks that ran for miles in straight lines, timber circles, sites that clearly meant something, even if we can't read them today. One of the best preserved snapshots of this period is found at Windmill Hill, not far from what would later become Stonehenge. It's a massive causewayed enclosure, surrounded by smaller burial sites and ritual avenues. It's like someone took a slice of society homes, graves, gathering places, and baked it into the chalk. By around 3000 BCE, this network of sites stretched across Britain. Communities were connected, ideas were moving, and so were goods. Jadeite axes from the Alps made it all the way to Cornwall. That's over 800 miles, no roads, no wheels, just sheer determination and some seriously blistered feet. Britain was no longer a lonely, soggy rock in the sea. It was part of something bigger, a web of trade and tradition that linked it to the European continent in invisible but powerful ways. But these early farmers, with all their rituals and boundary markers, were just laying the foundations. Because soon, their descendants would start hauling stones heavier than buses across hundreds of miles. Not for houses, not for defense, but for reasons no one can quite agree on. And if you thought this bit was strange, just wait until the giant circles start appearing. The fields were sown, the forest trimmed back, and permanent villages began to dot the landscape. But the story of ancient Britain didn't settle into a quiet farming rhythm. No, these early islanders had something else on their minds. Monuments, massive ones. If farming was their day job, constructing megalithic wonders was apparently their weekend hobby. It started subtly. Burial mounds, ditches, timber posts, aligned to sunrises. But by around 3000 BCE, Britain entered its monument-building era, with all the subtlety of a house cat bringing home a dead mouse. Proud, confusing, and oddly ceremonial, the land was soon dotted with structures that seemed to serve no practical purpose at all, which, as any historian will tell you, usually means religion. Take Stonehenge, not the tourist-filled roundabout we know today, but the earliest stages, which were basically just ditches and wooden posts. It evolved over centuries, changing shape and material as beliefs shifted. Stones came later, dragged from Wales. Yes, Wales. That's 50 miles across hilly terrain, with no wheels, no wagons, and a lot of complaining. And they weren't just dropping these stones randomly. The entire monument is a masterclass in alignment, with the solstices, lunar cycles, and probably several things we've yet to understand. It's not just a circle, it's a prehistoric calendar, ceremonial site, likely a high-stakes gathering place, all rolled into one. But Stonehenge was just the flashy cousin. All across Britain, similar structures rose: henges, cairns, passage tombs, Orkney's Mesher, Avebury's giant circles, the Ness of Brodgar. Each site was unique, but they all echoed a shared mindset. Death wasn't the end, and ancestors mattered a lot. Fringe fact, at some of these sites, especially in Orkney, there's evidence of feasting, massive quantities of animal bones, burnt pots, and even musical instruments. So picture this: people traveled from miles around, dragging animals, children, and possibly slightly annoyed spouses to party in the presence of the dead. What drove this obsession with monumentality? Historians still argue whether it was religion, astronomy, or just good old-fashioned one-upmanship. Huh, you built a tomb with 5 stones. Cute. We just finished dragging 75 of them uphill during a thunderstorm. But there's more than ego here. These places weren't just graveyards. They were nodes in a spiritual and political network. People didn't just build for their own dead. They built to be seen building. Participation in monument construction may have cemented alliances, settled disputes, or marked seasonal gatherings, like ancient festivals with pickaxes. And don't imagine these people as drab or brutish. They wore colorful clothing, used pigments on walls and bodies, and crafted beautiful pottery. There was art, there was music, there were rituals that made sense to them, even if they now sound like cryptic scavenger hunts in mud. One of the weirdest finds from this time: a chalk drum buried with 3 children in Yorkshire. It's beautifully carved, eerily precise, and get this, decorated with spirals and eyes. No one knows what it was for. A toy? A sacred object? A particularly unsettling housewarming gift? Meanwhile, everyday life trundled along. Farmers developed better tools, polished axes, stone querns for grinding grain, digging sticks. Their houses were rectangular, built from timber with thatched roofs. Pigs snuffled in pens, dogs guarded doorways, and sheep, well, sheep did sheep things. And yet, death was never far away. Burial practices varied wildly. Some bodies were placed in crouched positions in individual graves. Others were placed in collective tombs with skulls deliberately arranged. Some were cremated, others defleshed. It wasn't one tradition, it was a kaleidoscope of beliefs about the soul, memory, and landscape. By this time, the natural world wasn't just background scenery. Hills, rivers, and stones held meaning. Certain peaks were sacred. Waterways were boundaries between worlds. A lone standing stone wasn't a random rock, it was a marker, a memory, a message. And yet, cracks were forming. The very complexity that allowed for huge communal projects also required leadership, someone to organize labor, manage food stores, decide where the next ditch should go. And power, once introduced, tends to want more of itself. We start to see signs of hierarchy. Better graves, exotic goods like axe heads from Italy. Some people clearly had more stuff, and possibly more status, than others. But not everyone bought into it. In some regions, monument building abruptly stopped. Communities abandoned sites. Structures were dismantled or deliberately buried. Historians still argue whether this was religious reform, political revolt, or just people finally saying, you know what, no more dragging stones. Whatever the reason, by 2500 BCE, everything shifted again. Out went the old Neolithic ways. In came a new culture with new tools, new rituals, and a very different idea of what power looked like. They were the Beaker people, named after their fancy flared pottery, and they didn't just bring new cups, they brought metal. But let's not rush there just yet. For this brief window of history between 3000 and 2500 BCE, Britain was a place of monumental ambition. People organized labor without written laws. They created sacred landscapes using only stone, wood, and memory. They feasted, mourned, and whispered to the sky, hoping the stars would listen. They gave us the bones of British prehistory. And then, like all eras, they stepped aside. because copper was gleaming on the horizon, and with it came gold. So copper glinted on the horizon, and gold wasn't far behind. Around 200–500 BCE, Britain shifted again. Not with a bang, but with a pottery vessel. Specifically, a bell-shaped one that archaeologists who love a good literal name called a beaker, and just like that, we entered the beaker period. Now this isn't one of those moments where new people just pop up and everyone starts shaking hands. It's murkier than that. Historians still argue whether the beaker culture was a mass migration, a slow cultural exchange, or one of those awkward fusion moments where people swap traditions but forget to ask permission first. What's clear is this: something big changed. Beaker folk brought metal. At first, copper. Then, the big league, bronze. This new tech wasn't just about better blades. It meant prestige, power, status. You could smelt, hammer, and wear around your neck. For the first time, Britain saw elites using metal to stand out, and everyone else scrambling to keep up. And it didn't stop with tools. These newcomers or new ideas also brought a different burial style. Out went the collective tombs and long barrows. In came individual graves, often under round barrows. Those gentle mounds you still see scattered across the British countryside. Inside, bodies were curled in a fetal position, accompanied by beaker pots, flint daggers, and sometimes ornaments of gold. And yes, we mean gold. The Amesbury archer, buried not far from Stonehenge, had 2 gold hair tresses, copper knives, stone wrist guards, and a toolkit that screamed VIP. He even had a damaged knee that likely caused a painful limp, proof that even ancient prestige came with a cost. But this wasn't just a fashion show for the dead. These individual burials point to a society that was becoming more hierarchical, more personal. In the old Neolithic days, ancestors were buried together, the living stayed tied to the land and to memory. Now the focus was on individuals, heroes, chiefs, or more cynically, guys with good PR and shiny knives. Meanwhile, farming evolved. Metal tools made land clearing more efficient. Fields expanded, so did livestock herds. People weren't just scraping by. They were thriving, trading, and even importing exotic materials. Amber from the Baltic, jet from Whitby, tin from Cornwall, gold from Ireland. It all moved along complex trade routes, with no maps, no roads, and absolutely no customs checks. Fringe fact: some archaeologists believe Britain had one of the most generous early economies in Europe during this time. Not in terms of cash, of course, but in sheer hospitality and sharing of resources. Burial sites show people receiving goods from faraway regions. This wasn't just local networking, it was a prehistoric LinkedIn with better beads. Back at Stonehenge, the changes didn't go unnoticed. The site evolved. Sarsen stones were rearranged. Blue stones were relocated. Historians still argue whether this was a new religious function or just someone getting frustrated and moving all the furniture. But the important part: Stonehenge remained relevant. That's a big deal. In a time of cultural shifts and shiny new rituals, an old monument still mattered. People were using it, respecting it, maybe even reinterpreting it. It's a rare case of tradition adapting to change, instead of getting buried under it. Elsewhere, the Bronze Age continued to sparkle. Britain's skilled metalworkers were now producing intricate items: torques, sickles, axe heads, razors. Yes, razors. People cared about grooming. So next time you forget to shave, just remember, a guy in 1800 BCE was tidying his beard with a cast bronze blade, and probably judging you. Villages grew. Roundhouses appeared. Those iconic circular dwellings with central hearths, wattle and daub walls, and smoke that refused to leave politely through the roof. These homes weren't just shelters, they were status symbols, workplaces, and spiritual centers all rolled into one. And while we're at it, don't imagine these people were drab and muddy all the time. They wore dyed textiles, jewelry, and elaborate hairstyles. Archaeological finds even include tweezers and cosmetic kits. Yes, the Bronze Age had skincare. Your ancestors might have worn sheepskin, but they looked fabulous doing it. Of course, not everything was rosy. Competition for resources grew. Some settlements were built on hills for defense, Weapons became more deadly. Hoards of buried treasure suggest people were hiding valuables during times of tension, or offering them to gods they hoped were paying attention. And here's a juicy scholarly debate. Were these hoards offerings or insurance policies? Some may have been buried as gifts to divine forces. Please don't let the harvest fail, etc. While others might have been strategic stashes for a rainy or warlike day. Either way, much of that treasure never got dug up. Lucky for modern archaeologists, less lucky for the original owners. One major shift during this period was mobility. People moved more across regions, up hills, into river valleys. They built wooden trackways through bogs, carved canoes from hollowed logs, and may have even established seasonal markets. Britain was becoming connected not just socially, but economically. Ideas, goods, and gossip were flowing faster than ever. And speaking of gossip, let's talk hill forts. They weren't full-blown castles, but they were strategic, built on elevated ground with earthwork defenses. They suggest a world where power was more contested. Not everyone agreed who the top dog was. And in a land with growing wealth and shrinking patience, conflict was inevitable. But here's the twist. Most hill forts weren't actually used for battles. There's little evidence of sieges or dramatic last stands. Instead, they may have been symbols, status, statements. A way of saying, look what we can build, come trade or else. So by the end of this period, Britain had transformed from a scattered landscape of foragers and small farmers into a glittering web of tribal societies, linked by trade, shaped by monuments, and ruled by those who had the biggest feasts or the flashiest swords. Still, cracks were starting to show. The systems that held this shiny new world together were fragile, reliant on climate, cooperation, and some seriously long-distance networking. And when that web started to unravel, the entire Bronze Age glitter began to tarnish. The Bronze Age glimmered like freshly polished metal. Until it didn't. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, things across Europe started to wobble. And in Britain, the shine began to fade. Not instantly, not everywhere, but slowly, steadily. Something was coming undone. The old order cracked, and the people who had once built glorious tombs and gilded treasures began to vanish into the hills. This wasn't just a British problem. Across the Mediterranean, entire civilizations collapsed. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the grand palaces of Crete. They all crumbled. Cities were abandoned, trade routes snapped, and the world seemed to downshift into survival mode. Historians still argue whether this was caused by drought, war, mass migration, or a particularly catastrophic round of bad decisions. Britain didn't have cities to burn or empires to topple. But it had something to lose. Its connections. Those elaborate long-distance trade networks, the ones that had brought amber, gold, and prestige, started to unravel. Without them, the prestige goods dried up. Without the goods, the power structures weakened. And without the power, well, there wasn't much reason to keep building like everything was fine. Evidence of this collapse is subtle. Fewer bronze artifacts, fewer imported goods. Settlements became smaller, more defensive. Roundhouses moved to hilltops, or tucked themselves into valleys. The idea was no longer to impress, but to endure. And while we're here, let's pause for a moment to mourn the disappearance of British gold masks and bronze razors. Somewhere out there, a whole generation of stylish warriors had to settle for being both unfashionable and under threat. But even as the old systems decayed, something new began to rise. People adapted. They reorganized. They looked inward instead of outward. Local crafts returned. Tools got simpler, sturdier. Life became about food, shelter, and watching the horizon for strangers. Still, we're not talking doomsday. This wasn't the end of civilization. It was more like someone unplugging the speaker during the best part of the party. Everything just got quieter, more cautious, more local. And yet, even in this quieter time, people kept building. Not flashy tombs, but earthworks. Massive linear ditches that cut through the landscape for miles. Their purpose? Unknown. Maybe boundaries, maybe symbolic. Or maybe just bored farmers doing extreme landscaping. Fringe theory. Some scholars think these giant ditches were designed to funnel deer into traps. Others say they were markers between rival groups, or warning signs. This is our turf. Turn your ox cart around. Whatever their purpose, they remind us that even during decline, people didn't stop shaping the land. They just shifted how and why they shaped it. Religious beliefs also evolved. Gone were the large communal tombs and grand stone circles. In their place came smaller, more personal rituals. People buried offerings in pits, dropped objects into rivers, and carefully placed tools or jewelry in bogs. It's as if the gods had moved out of the sky and into the mud. And that's where things get weird, because some of these deposits are beyond explanation. Axes buried with no signs of use. Swords snapped deliberately before being offered to a lake. It's not practicality, it's symbolism. You don't throw your best sword into a river unless something or someone really important is watching. Meanwhile, bronze didn't disappear. It just became harder to access. Tin and copper had to be mined, and with trade disrupted, local supplies dwindled. Some communities began to recycle old metal melting down, broken tools, or looted treasures. It was less about creating new wealth, and more about keeping what little you had functional. And then, silence. For several centuries, Britain becomes harder to read. Fewer grand sights, fewer objects. It's what archaeologists call a dark age, not because it was evil or gloomy, but because the light of clear evidence fades. People lived, people died, but they left fewer fingerprints. This raises the eternal chicken or egg question. Did people stop making big things because they lost the skills, or because their priorities shifted? Historians still argue, but maybe it's not about ability at all. Maybe it's about choosing not to waste energy on symbols when your belly is empty, and your goats keep vanishing mysteriously into the woods. Yet even in this quiet period, seeds of change were growing. Iron was on the horizon, and iron didn't just change the game. It flipped the board, burned the rulebook, and buried the referee under a pile of swords. Because with iron came not just better tools, but more tools. Iron was abundant, widespread, and durable. It meant more farmers could work more land. More warriors could wield deadlier weapons. Power stopped being concentrated in a few shiny bronze objects and spread outward into many sharp, utilitarian ones. But that's still to come. Right now, in this lull, Britain was holding its breath. Hill forts stood watch on misty ridges. Livestock trudged across worn paths. People looked to the old monuments and wondered why their ancestors had hauled rocks across counties. Maybe they felt proud. Maybe they felt confused. Or maybe they just thought, wow, they had way more free time than we do. So the age of gold and glimmer dimmed. The people who built Stonehenge, who smelted bronze, who traded amber and polished jet, they faded, not in catastrophe, but in quietness. And as always, the land waited. When the silence finally broke, it did so with iron. Not in a thunderous charge or a dramatic drum roll, but in the hiss of forge fires and the ring of new tools shaping old land. Somewhere around 800 BCE, Iron Age Britain stirred awake, not as a single kingdom, but as a patchwork of shifting tribes, crisscrossed alliances, and sudden swagger. The Bronze Age's glitter had faded, but now came something grittier, more robust and arguably way more intense. Iron wasn't rare like tin or copper. You didn't have to trade for it. You could dig it up practically in your backyard. That meant iron tools could be made by more people, for more people. Axes, plowshares, sickles, spears. They weren't just sharper, they were democratized. In a way, iron spread power. And power, once spread, rarely sits still. Communities expanded, forests shrank, fields grew broader. With better tools came better farming, and with better farming came surpluses. And with surpluses, status. Suddenly, you could feed a few extra mouths, craftspeople, warriors, maybe even someone whose job was just to sit around looking important. Power structures returned, and they strutted back in with an iron sword at their side. And that sword wasn't just for show. While earlier bronze weapons had been ceremonial or symbolic, iron swords were built to kill. That's not to say blood flowed constantly across the countryside, but the weapons were sharper, the armor more developed, and the willingness to defend or claim territory became more pronounced. Cue the hill forts. Remember those earlier ones that may have been used more for show than for war? Iron Age hill forts were beefed up. Bigger banks, deeper ditches, more planning. These weren't just spiritual symbols, they were practical strongholds. Some could hold entire communities. Maiden Castle in Dorset, for example, was practically a prehistoric fortress city. But here's where it gets interesting. Even in these fortified settlements, daily life carried on as normal. People raised livestock, made cheese, spun wool, played music, brewed ale, and complained about the weather. The forts weren't always preparing for siege. They were preparing for survival, defense, yes, but also identity. These were tribal strongholds, each one flying its own invisible banner of "we are not them." And those tribes? They were many. Historians name some of them later on, like the Atrebates, Iceni, Brigantes. But by the early Iron Age, the names are lost. What we do see is regional variety, different pottery styles, different burial rites, different ways of building houses. Britain wasn't a nation, it wasn't even close. It was a swirling stew of microcultures, each carving out space and defending it, sometimes with words, often with weapons. Fringe detail. Iron Age Britons practiced body art. We're talking wog tattoos, piercings, maybe even scarification. So those warriors you're picturing, they weren't just armed, they were decorated. This wasn't just battle, it was performance. And performances need an audience. That's where feasting came in. Large communal meals were more than just food. They were power rituals. You fed the people, you won their loyalty, you roasted an entire pig, poured barley beer into clay mugs, and passed around smoked cheese like it was currency. The biggest feasts weren't just indulgence. They were politics with a full stomach. Alongside this growing social complexity came religion. Druidism, or at least its early forms, began to emerge. Druids weren't just priests. They were judges, philosophers, scientists, and magicians, all rolled into one. The Roman writer Julius Caesar would later describe them as controlling everything from education to criminal trials. A bit biased perhaps, but it suggests serious clout. Historians still argue whether Druidism was a widespread organized religion or just a loose set of local traditions bundled together later by outsiders. Either way, Iron Age religion was tied to nature. Groves, rivers, sacred hills. These were temple, and offerings flowed, weapons dropped into lakes, food left in pits, figurines buried in fields. There were gods in the trees, spirits in the streams, and ancestors in the ground. One curious archaeological find: bog bodies. Perfectly preserved corpses pulled from wetlands, often with signs of ritual death. These weren't accidents, they were sacrifices. Their expressions, sometimes serene, sometimes pained, whisper of ceremonies we may never fully understand. A gift to the gods, a punishment, a king's final act. The open scholarly debate, whether these bog deaths were voluntary or forced, did the chosen accept their fate as part of a religious duty, or were they condemned? The truth may lie somewhere in between, but what's clear is that the Iron Age mind saw the world as deeply interconnected: land, spirit, blood, and memory, one continuous web. Meanwhile, down in the valleys, metal workers were becoming celebrities. Creating an iron sword was a mix of chemistry, craftsmanship, and mysticism. They used charcoal for fuel, bellows for heat, and sheer experience to judge when the metal was ready. No thermometers, no safety goggles, just sweat, smoke, and probably a lot of burned eyebrows. And they didn't stop at weapons. Jewelry, decorative harnesses, helmets, artistry flourished. The Celtic style we often associate with intricate knotwork and spirals had its roots here. These weren't crude brutes. They had elegance, precision, and aesthetic vision. But with beauty came brutality. As power concentrated in tribal leaders, disputes escalated. Some hill forts bear scars, burned layers, smashed pottery, hasty burials. Not every conflict was ceremonial. Some were deadly. Raiders came at dawn. Allies turned. Fires took hold. Yet through it all, life went on. Children were born. Sheep got sheared. Songs were sung around hearths. Communities adapted. They raised granaries on stilts, improved ploughing techniques, and even created simple coins, little tokens of metal used to trade. This wasn't just survival, it was innovation. Iron had brought more than strength, it had brought complexity. The people of Britain were now tougher, smarter, and more organized. And somewhere along the line, they started noticing something strange on the horizon. Ships. Not the odd visitor, not just traders, but fleets. And with them a familiar name, Rome. Rome didn't arrive in Britain with trumpets and flags, at least not at first. The earliest contact was more like a polite knock on the door, followed by a curious peek inside. Traders had been coming across the channel for years, ferrying wine, olive oil, and glossy red pottery in exchange for tin, grain, and possibly the occasional bear. Yes, Britons did keep bears, and exporting them to Roman arenas was for a while a weirdly viable business model. By the time the Roman Republic started flexing its muscle, Britain was already buzzing with trade. Local elites in southern England were growing richer off continental connections. They wore imported jewelry, drank wine from Gaul, and got very into Roman ideas of sophistication, like coins with faces, stylized gods, and a fondness for roads that went in straight lines. The archaeology backs it up. In places like Kent and Sussex, you can find fragments of amphorae, those big two-handled jars Romans used to lug wine around. And who was drinking it? Likely tribal leaders, trying to impress neighbors by pouring French Merlot into clay cups and calling it power. But Rome wasn't just selling luxury. They were selling an idea, a world of order, law, and empire. And British chieftains, especially those down south, couldn't help but be drawn to it. Some even started minting coins with Latin inscriptions, or copied Roman hairstyles. Imagine trying to hold a feast while copying Roman table manners and pretending you knew what a toga was. One such tribe was the Atrebites. Based around modern-day Hampshire and Sussex, they had close ties with Gaul. Some of their leaders even ruled territory on both sides of the channel. Their coins show a blend of British symbolism with Roman flair, boars, horses, and the occasional attempt at Latin that reads like someone used Google Translate without the grammar plugin. Meanwhile, up north, things were different. Tribal groups in Scotland, Wales, and northern England kept to their own styles. They were less interested in Roman wine and more into cattle, feasting, and painting their bodies with woe. The south was cossying up to empire, but the north was sharpening spears and grumbling about foreigners. Then, around 55 BCE, something unexpected happened. Julius Caesar showed up. Now Caesar didn't actually want Britain, not at first. His real problem was Gaul, and the British tribes kept sending support across the channel, chariots, warriors, and maybe some good gossip. So Caesar figured, why not pop over, flex a bit, and make sure Britain knew who was boss? So he did. His first invasion, in 55 BCE, was a mess. Storms nearly wrecked his fleet. The local Britons put up stiff resistance, and he had to retreat after a few skirmishes and a rather damp morale. But Caesar was nothing if not persistent. He came back the next year with more ships, more men, and more resolve. This time, he made it further inland. There were battles, hostages taken, alliances formed, but still no real conquest. And here's the twist, Caesar left again. Voluntarily. Britain hadn't been conquered. He had made some deals, secured some tribal allegiance, and declared it a success. Then he went back to Gaul and wrote about the whole thing like he'd just discovered Atlantis. Historians still argue whether these expeditions were serious invasions or PR stunts to boost Caesar's political image back in Rome. Either way, they left a mark. Roman interest in Britain spiked. Maps were updated. Tribal leaders began choosing sides, some leaning into Roman alliance, others preparing for a future where those straight roads might come with straight swords. The effect was psychological. For the first time, the tribes of Britain had to reckon with a force much larger than any neighbor, more organized than any rival. The Romans had elephants, siege engines, and a fondness for bureaucracy. They didn't raid, they absorbed. And in the decades that followed Caesar's visit, that looming presence only grew. Trade expanded. Roman goods flooded southern Britain. Some local leaders built Roman-style villas. Others carved boundaries with new fortifications. Everyone was waiting, some in hope, others in dread. But the real invasion, the one that would rewrite Britain's history, hadn't happened yet. Caesar was just the warm-up act. Meanwhile, everyday life rolled on. Farmers planted barley, herders moved sheep, ironworkers forged tools. But under it all, something was shifting. The balance of power, the idea of identity. Britain was no longer isolated. It was a prize, one that Rome had glanced at, sniffed, and then walked away from. For now. And remember those fancy southern tribes with their Roman connections. They started acting like miniature empires themselves, building alliances, issuing coins, settling disputes like junior senators. They may not have worn togas, but they certainly played the part. Fringe fact: some British leaders even visited Rome. Tigidebus, a southern king from the next century, was so chummy with the empire he got a Roman-style palace at Fishbourne, complete with mosaics, columns, and underfloor heating. A literal Roman holiday. But not everyone liked this creeping influence. In the highlands and hinterlands, resentment simmered. The Romans weren't just traders, they were meddlers. And if they ever returned, it wouldn't be for wine and conversation. It would be for conquest. So Britain, on the eve of real invasion, was a land divided, south and east, increasingly Romanized, north and west, fiercely independent. And somewhere in the middle, tribal leaders trying to keep the peace while keeping an eye on the coast. Because those ships, they were coming back, and next time, they wouldn't be leaving politely. When Rome finally came for Britain in earnest, it came with a thunderclap, not just of swords and marching boots, but of bureaucracy, architecture, and one very determined emperor in 43 CE, under the rule of Emperor Claudius, who had something to prove after being dismissed for years as a stuttering, unlikely leader. The legions landed again, and this time they were here to stay. The invasion force was massive by Roman standards, around 40,000 troops, including infantry, cavalry, engineers, and at least one war elephant. Because apparently subtlety wasn't Claudius's style. The target? Southern Britain, particularly the tribal heartlands of those who'd once flirted with Rome and were now acting a bit too independently. First came the shock and awe. Cities fell, tribal resistance crumbled. Some leaders, like the famed Tigidebus, sided with Rome immediately and were rewarded with kingship under Roman guidance. Others, like Careticus of the Cativelloni, chose to fight. Careticus became a thorn in Rome's perfectly sandaled foot. He led guerrilla campaigns in the hills, regrouped in Wales, and resisted for nearly a decade. His eventual capture was a Roman PR win, especially when he was paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. But rather than being executed, he impressed the Senate with a fiery speech and was allowed to live. It's one of those rare moments when defiance earned respect instead of decapitation. But even with rebellions simmering, Rome dug in. Literally, they started building roads, forts, temples, bathhouses. The landscape changed almost overnight. Imagine a small farming village waking up to see an aqueduct creeping across the horizon, like some giant stone caterpillar. Wherever the legions went, Roman order followed. You didn't just get a military presence, you got milestones, tax collectors, and someone asking why your temple didn't have marble columns. Fringe detail. The Romans renamed towns, but not always creatively. Londinium, London, Eboracum, York, and Aquae Sulis, Bath, all became regional hubs, sprouting villas, forums, and suspiciously advanced plumbing systems. In Bath, they even built a full-scale spa complex atop local hot springs, because even conquerors enjoy a nice soak. But not everyone was thrilled. In the west and north, resentment brewed. The local economy shifted under Roman taxation. Farmland was taken, and native religions were mocked or absorbed. And then came the moment that would ignite Britain's most famous rebellion. Enter Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, a tribe in eastern England. Boudica had ruled alongside her husband Prosuturgus. When he died, he tried to be clever, leaving half his kingdom to Rome, half to his daughters. Rome didn't do half. They took everything, flogged Boudica, and assaulted her daughters. It was the worst kind of arrogance, cruel, unnecessary, and deeply stupid. So Boudica struck back. She led a full-scale revolt, rallying disaffected tribes and marching with an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands. Though, as always, take Roman numbers with a pinch of salt and a raised eyebrow. What is clear is this: she burned Londinium, destroyed Colchester, and razed Verulamium. Roman citizens were slaughtered, temples torched, and governors caught running for the coast in various stages of panic. The rebellion shook the province to its core. Rome responded with brutal efficiency. Governor Suetonius regrouped, lured Boudica into open battle, and using classic Roman tactics annihilated her forces. Boudica either poisoned herself or died from illness shortly after. Historians still argue over her exact fate, but her legend was set in stone, both literally and metaphorically. The aftermath was predictably Roman. Punishments were severe, but the lesson was learned. Don't push too hard. Rome softened its approach. They built more infrastructure, encouraged local elites to Romanize peacefully, and let people keep some traditions, as long as taxes were paid on time, and no one else tried the whole burn everything strategy again. Over the next decades, Roman Britain settled into an uneasy rhythm. The legions stayed, villas popped up in the countryside, tribal leaders learned Latin, towns grew, and some even got fancy public amenities like hippocaust heating and amphitheaters. And yet scratch the surface, and you'd still find native beliefs, druidic symbols, and people whispering in old languages when the taxman wasn't looking. Druids, for their part, did not survive Roman attention. They had power, influence, and the audacity to not be Roman, which made them prime targets. The final blow came in Anglesey, a druidic stronghold in Wales. The Romans crossed the Menai Strait, torched the groves, and massacred the priests. One Roman writer described women screaming with wild hair and blackened faces, either a dramatic flourish or a terrifying reality. Either way, that was the end of the Druid hierarchy as a public institution. But Druids didn't vanish. They adapted, went underground, became folklore and forest ghosts. The Romans thought they'd erased them. The British people just called them something else and carried on. By the end of the 1st century CE, Britain was a full Roman province. Not everyone was happy, but not everyone was suffering either. Roman law brought order, Roman coinage brought trade, Roman religion brought temples to Jupiter, Mars, and later, Christ. British identity was being reshaped, remixed, and overwritten, but never completely erased. Still, beneath the paved roads and tiled villas, the land remembered. Old hill forts watched silently from the ridges. Barrow mounds rose like ancient echoes, and in the forests and moors people still whispered the old names of rivers, stones, and sky. Rome had come, Rome had conquered. But Britain hadn't fully left. By the 2nd century CE, Roman Britain was rich, weird, and a little bit tense. On the surface it looked like Rome had won. Stone towns gleamed with imported marble, togas flapped in the breeze, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifted from street stalls. Villas sprawled across the countryside, stocked with mosaics, underfloor heating, and suspiciously smug sheep. And yet, under all this Roman polish, things were more complicated. Start with the economy. Britain had become a key part of the empire's supply chain, exporting grain, metals, hides, and even hunting dogs. Roman Britain was productive, and that meant taxes, lots of taxes, collected by men in sandals who didn't mind taking a few chickens as collateral if your coins ran dry. But alongside those taxes came jobs. Roads needed building, forts needed staffing, merchants needed wares. Local artisans adapted Roman styles to British tastes, producing pottery with odd hybrid designs, Celtic swirls on Roman shapes, like someone had tried to carve Latin homework into a spiral-bound notebook. And trade reached everywhere. Glass from the Rhineland, oil from Spain, Semian ware from Gaul. You could find a Roman dining set in a house just a few miles from Hadrian's Wall, though it might be sitting next to an old cauldron still used for midsummer pig-boiling ritual. One standout feature of Roman Britain was its diversity. The legions were full of soldiers from all over the empire: North Africa, Syria, the Danube, Germania. Some stayed, married local women, raised families. Gravestones show names from across the empire, tucked into British soil. This wasn't just Roman conquest, it was Roman blending. And then there were the gods. Oh, the gods. They multiplied like rabbits in a temple. Jupiter stood beside local deities like Solis and Nodens. Shrines popped up to Mercury, Mars, Mithras, and dozens of unnamed spirits. The Romans were surprisingly chill about who you worshipped, as long as you didn't challenge the emperor's divine PR campaign. In Bath, at Solis, the goddess Solis was worshipped alongside Minerva in a spa complex, where people tossed curses into the sacred spring. These weren't vague prayers, they were specific, angry little scrolls asking the goddess to strike down someone who stole their cloak or sandals. May he lose his mind and his eyebrows was not an uncommon request. Fringe fact, many of these curses were written backwards, in crude Latin, and rolled up into tiny lead scrolls. Ancient petty complaints immortalized for archaeologists to puzzle over with raised eyebrows and half smiles. Meanwhile, outside the towns and villas, much of Britain remained, well, British. Roundhouses still dotted the hills. People still herded sheep, fished rivers, told stories. The Roman way of life didn't reach everyone. For many, especially in the north and west, Rome was something that happened over there, not right here. And Rome knew it. That's why they built walls. Hadrian's Wall, finished around 2128 CE, stretched 73 miles across northern Britain. It wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement. This far, no farther. On one side, Roman order. On the other, wild tribes, misty hills, and a lot of angry weather. The wall was garrisoned by troops from across the empire, who probably spent more time managing sheep disputes than fighting actual enemies. And even then, Rome wasn't done. A few decades later, Emperor Antoninus pushed even further north and built another wall. Antonine's Wall, shorter and more optimistic. It didn't last. Eventually, Rome pulled back to Hadrian's line and said, "Right, that'll do." But defending Britain came at a cost. The province was expensive to hold. Rebellions flared. Bandits roamed the countryside. In some places, Roman rule felt more like a distant rumor than a daily reality. And the people themselves, they adapted. Some became Roman in name and fashion, wearing tunics, building shrines, speaking broken Latin. Others held on to old ways, worshipping local gods, painting bodies for festivals, passing down stories of long-dead warriors who rode chariots and spoke to thunder. Historians still argue whether Roman Britain was truly Romanized, or just lightly dipped in imperial sauce. The answer seems to be both. In towns, Roman life thrived. In the countryside, it simmered. And in the far reaches, Scotland, Wales, it barely touched the ground. But cracks were beginning to show. By the late 2nd century, the empire itself was under pressure. Civil wars, economic trouble, plagues. In Britain, fortresses were reinforced, coinage devalued, some villas fell into disrepair, trade slowed, and somewhere in the forests and moors people remembered a time before marble roads and taxmen. And yet, life went on. Markets bustled, fields were ploughed, people were born, loved, died. For all its tension, Roman Britain in this era was stable, just a bit edgy, like a party that's gone on a little too long and the host is starting to worry about the wine running out. There was comfort, baths, temples, roads, a sense of belonging to something massive, even if that something was 3 weeks' sail away and sometimes forgot your name. But behind the mosaic floors and painted walls, the empire was changing, the center was shifting, power was fragmenting, and Britain, this odd, distant province at the edge of everything, wasn't ready for what came next. Because the legions, they wouldn't stay forever. And when they left, they wouldn't lock the door behind them. So there Britain stood, proudly wearing its Roman robes, sipping imported wine, and trying not to notice that those robes were beginning to fray. By the 3rd century, the cracks in the empire were no longer subtle. Civil wars flared up with the frequency of bad harvests. Emperors came and went, some in power for months, others for mere weeks. The center could no longer hold, and at the edge of the world, Britain started to feel very, very far away. The result? a strange combination of opulence and anxiety. On one hand, the 3rd century saw the height of villa life in Britain. The countryside bloomed with luxurious estates, complete with heated floors, frescoed walls, and vineyards that optimistically pretended Britain was Italy. These weren't small holdings, they were rural palaces, symbols of wealth, Roman culture, and the triumph of imported ambition. And yet, at the same time, coins were being hoarded, town walls were hastily reinforced, and more people started burying their valuables in fields, just in case. These weren't trust fund Romans sipping mulled wine in peace. They were people very aware that things could go sideways. One of the strangest episodes of this era, the so-called Gallic Empire, between 260 and 274 CE, Britain, Gaul and parts of Germany broke away from Rome altogether. Yet, Britain was briefly part of its own short-lived empire, one that functioned almost like an emergency patch, while Rome figured out what on earth it was doing. It was like your phone crashing and rebooting in safe mode. Functional, but glitchy. Then came a man named Carausius, a Roman naval commander with a flair for rebellion. Carausius declared himself Emperor of Britain in 286 CE. He had ships, forts, coins with his face on them, and a strong enough navy that Rome couldn't immediately stop him. For nearly a decade he ruled as a rogue emperor, half pirate king, half bureaucratic headache. Fringe detail: Carausius' coins were surprisingly high quality and included Latin slogans like Restituta Britannia, Restorer of Britain. He wasn't just seizing power, he was playing politics, making a case, rebranding Britain as strong, independent, and still very much Roman, but under new management. Eventually, though, Rome sent a competent enforcer, Constans Chlorus, who crossed the Channel and retook Britain. Carausius was betrayed and murdered by his own finance minister, as is tradition when your imperial dreams overstay their welcome. Still, the message was clear: Britain had a taste for independence now, and the empire's grip was slipping. In the countryside, changes were happening too. Some villas flourished, expanding with bigger courtyards and mosaic floors that were almost aggressively optimistic. Others were abandoned or converted into workshops, storehouses, or weirdly shaped barns. The economy was shifting, trade networks faltered, coins became smaller, cruder, gold became rare. People started bartering again. Religion shifted too. Pagan temples still functioned, but Christianity was beginning to take root, quietly at first, then more openly. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire. By the 4th century, Britain had its own bishops, churches were being built, pagan altars were repurposed, sometimes awkwardly. But again, this wasn't a clean sweep. Paganism didn't vanish. It lingered in rural festivals, whispered prayers, and household shrines. People hedged their bets. They might visit a Christian church and leave a votive offering at a spring on the way home. Spiritual insurance, if you will. Historians still argue whether Christianity in Roman Britain was widespread or limited to towns and elites. The answer, likely patchy. In Londinium or Abericum, you might hear hymns echoing in a basilica. In the hills of Wales, probably still talking to tree spirits and politely ignoring the bishop's letters. But even with these religious shifts, the bigger threat was political. The 4th century saw mounting pressure on Roman Britain's borders. Saxon raiders began probing the eastern coast, hitting undefended settlements and vanishing before the legions could respond. To deal with them, the Romans built a series of coastal forts known as the Saxon Shore. Whether these were meant to defend against Saxons or host them as allies is still debated, but either way, it was clear that Britain wasn't safe. And neither were the legions. Rome was being pulled in every direction. Germanic tribes were pressing along the Rhine. The Huns were beginning to make ominous appearances in the east. Resources were thin. Troops were thinner, and Britain, remote, expensive, difficult to hold, began to look like dead weight. So Rome started withdrawing, not in one dramatic moment, but in slow, shrugging retreat. Fewer reinforcements, less investment, governors getting more ambitious, more rogue. Local leaders had to step up, and so Britain found itself in a familiar position, looking inward. By the early 5th century, the writing was on the wall. mostly because no one had the budget to repaint it. In 410 CE, Emperor Honorius wrote his famously vague letter to the British cities, essentially saying, "Defend yourselves. We're out." And just like that, the legions were gone. No dramatic sailing away, no farewell parades, just absence. Rome didn't fall so much as fade, and Britain, for the first time in centuries, was left to stand on its own feet, without tax collectors, without governors, without legions. What came next wasn't a collapse. Exactly, it was a reversion. Towns were abandoned or shrank. Villas crumbled. Trade nearly stopped. Some leaders clung to Roman traditions, Latin titles, coin hoards, crumbling city walls. Others looked elsewhere for power, old tribal loyalties, ancestral gods, local warbands. Roman Britain had ended, but the people were still there. The land was still farmed. Stories were still told. And in the absence of empire, something new was already stirring out of the ruins, through the smoke, into the open. And its name wasn't England. Not yet. When the legions vanished in the early 400s, they didn't take the roads, the villas, or the memories with them. Roman Britain hadn't disappeared. It had simply lost its spine. The land still bore the bones of empire, but the muscles had gone slack, and into that vacuum stepped chaos, not with trumpets or banners, but with confusion, power grabs, and the creeping sense that no one was really in charge anymore. Imagine you're a town magistrate in Londinium. One year, you're collecting taxes and arguing over the width of the villa's hypercost system. The next, the governor's vanished. The troops are gone, and suddenly there are Saxon ships peeking over the horizon. You have walls, yes, but no one to man them. So people did what people always do when governments vanish. They improvised. Local strongmen, often former Roman officials, war veterans or ambitious aristocrats, began grabbing power. Some called themselves tyrants, not in the mustache-twirling way, but in the Roman sense, temporary rulers during crisis. Temporary, of course, being very optimistic. And soon, a weird mix of Roman and tribal customs fused. Latin still echoed in dusty courtyards. Bishops tried to maintain spiritual order, but the army now consisted of whoever could hold a sword and shout orders without flinching. Town councils became war councils. Forts became fiefdoms. One of the few glimpses we have into this murky post-Roman period is the figure of Vortigern, a name that may or may not be a title meaning great king. He's credited or blamed in later chronicles for one colossal decision, inviting Germanic mercenaries to help fight local threats. These warriors, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, arrived from what's now northern Germany and Denmark. Fringe detail: Vortigern may have offered them land as payment, which worked brilliantly until the mercenaries realized they liked Britain far better than wherever they'd come from, and decided to stay. With swords. That's how it started. Not with a conquering horde, but with hired help that overstayed its welcome. And the local Britons, they fought back. Some banded together under warlords. Others fled west, into the hills of Wales and Cornwall. Still others tried to preserve Roman traditions, setting up little pseudo-states with Latin inscriptions, crumbling forums, and bishops desperately trying to keep the liturgical calendar straight. Historians still argue whether these early Saxon arrivals were a trickle or a flood. Was it mass migration or elite takeover? Did they settle peacefully or burn everything first and ask questions later? The archaeological record shows both patterns. Burials full of Germanic grave goods next to sites of clear destruction. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they torched, sometimes both in the same week. One thing's clear, the language changed. Latin faded. British Celtic dialects clung on in the west, but in the east and south, a new tongue began to rise. Early Old English. Not fully formed yet, but gaining ground. Along with it came new customs, new religions, the old pagan ones, not Christianity, and new political structures. And yet, through this cultural churn, fragments of Roman Britain clung on like ivy on a ruined wall. Take Wroxeter. Once a Roman city, it slowly devolved into a rural stronghold. But even in the 500s, someone was maintaining Roman-style baths. The heating system still ran. The town had workshops, imported goods, and an elite household that clearly remembered how things used to be. Or consider Tintagel, in Cornwall, known today for its Arthurian mist and dramatic cliffs. It was once a thriving post-Roman trading hub, and Fari, from the Mediterranean, kept showing up there, proof that even as Rome collapsed, someone was still popping corks and enjoying foreign oil. Because here's the truth, Britain didn't fall into darkness, it just shifted to candlelight. Yes, cities shrank, roads crumbled, literacy dipped, but people adapted. They rebuilt in timber instead of stone. They buried their dead in new ways. And they told stories, some about the past, some entirely made up, and some that would become legends. Which brings us to Arthur, or rather, Arthur. This period is fertile ground for myths, and Arthur looms large. Was he a real warlord who led British resistance against the Saxons? Was he a later invention, heroic nostalgia for a time when someone, anyone, seemed to have things under control? Historians still argue. The earliest references are vague. No castles, no knights, no round tables, just a name. Maybe. But whether Arthur lived or not, someone was fighting. Battles are recorded, forts were refortified. Britain wasn't conquered overnight, it was wrestled for, inch by muddy inch. Religion shifted again. Christianity, once elite and Roman, became grassroots in Celtic. Monasteries in Wales, Ireland, and Cornwall kept the faith alive. Not just spiritually, but intellectually. They preserved texts, taught reading, and quietly reconnected to Europe long after Rome had forgotten them. One fringe hero of this time, St. Patrick. Yep, the same one with the snakes. Born in Roman Britain, kidnapped to Ireland, escaped, then returned as a missionary. His life straddles two worlds, the last days of empire, and the birth of something new. And slowly, imperceptibly, that new thing began to grow. By the late 400s and early 500s, Saxon kingdoms were taking shape. Kent, Sussex, Essex, their leaders claimed divine ancestry, buried themselves with swords and treasures, and built great halls from wood and pride. But they weren't alone. In the West, British strongholds endured. In Strathclyde, Powys, Gwynedd, and Dumnonia, leaders resisted, ruled, and remembered. They built hill forts, wrote poetry, and kept speaking their old tongue, long after Latin had faded like chalk in the rain. So this was post-Roman Britain, a land of splinters, of tiny kingdoms, tribal warlords, shifting languages, and half-forgotten gods. Some lived in ruins, others in palaces made from timber and dream. But beneath it all was continuity. The land still bore scars, the stones still whispered, and somewhere, someone was still carrying a chipped Roman coin, wondering what it used to mean. By the 6th century, the chaos was settling, but into what, exactly, no one could quite agree. Britain wasn't Roman anymore, but it wasn't English yet either. What it was depended entirely on where you stood. If you were in the West, in Wales, Cornwall, or parts of Cumbria, you might still speak a language close to that of the old Britons. You might even live in a stone roundhouse near the ruins of a Roman villa, and tell your children stories about the old days, when emperors ruled and roads actually led somewhere. If you were in the East, the world looked very different. The newcomers, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, were digging in. They weren't just raiders anymore, they were settlers, farmers, kings. And they were building something entirely new from the ruins they'd once looted. These early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia, weren't copies of Roman provinces. They were tribal realms with wooden halls, warrior codes, and a fondness for large feasts and larger swords. Kings weren't emperors, they were war leaders, expected to win battles, keep oaths, and reward their followers with rings, meat, and the occasional very awkward poem. That warrior culture is beautifully captured in the epic Beowulf. Written down centuries later, it echoes this time of gold, blood, and brittle alliances. A world where your reputation was your currency, your sword had a name, and your enemies sometimes turned into dragons. Okay, maybe not literally, but you never really know with poets. Still, not everything was heroic feasting. Life was hard. Most people were farmers. Their houses were timber-framed huts with thatched roofs and a central hearth. They grew barley, raised pigs, spun wool, and counted the seasons with worried eyes. Plague still visited, famine was never far away, and politics. Oh, politics was a knife fight, wrapped in a marriage proposal. One of the most striking symbols of this era is Sutton Hoo, a burial mound in Suffolk, uncovered in 1939. Inside it, archaeologists found a ship, a warrior king's armor, gold buckles, silver bowls, and a helmet so dramatic it now lives in the British Museum like a warlord's Instagram profile picture. Fringe fact: that helmet, with its snarling faceplate and dragon wing eyebrows, wasn't just for battle, it was theatrical, regal, a statement. Whoever was buried there wasn't just a king, he was the king, or at least, he really wanted to be remembered as one. Meanwhile, in the Christian West, monasticism was quietly making a comeback. Not Roman Christianity exactly, but a Celtic variant, gentler, more nature-infused and wildly independent. Monks like St. David and St. Columba wandered into hills and islands, set up small monasteries, and began writing, copying, and praying with impressive focus and extremely uncomfortable robes. Ireland, untouched by Roman occupation, became a spiritual powerhouse. Its missionaries sailed east, bringing literacy, theology, and a quiet defiance of Rome's crumbling shadow. Iona, Lindisfarne, and other island monasteries would soon become lighthouses in the fog. And here's where things get really tangled. Because while pagan Saxon kings ruled the east, Christian monks were slipping in through the west and north, and eventually the two worlds collided, not with swords but with sermons. Take King Ethelbert of Kent. In 5097 CE, Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine, not that Augustine, a different one, to Britain to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Ethelbert, to his credit, didn't kill him. Instead, he listened, and eventually he converted, becoming the first Christian king among the newcomers. This marked a turning point. Christianity, with all its text, rituals, and holy days, offered something tribal societies craved: legitimacy. If a king ruled with the church, he ruled by divine sanction. Suddenly, altars appeared next to thrones, priests whispered in royal ears, and literacy, once nearly extinct in Britain, began to rise from the ashes. Still, not all Saxon kingdoms were keen. Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex all took different paths, at different paces. Some kings converted, and then converted back, depending on whether prayers or sacrifices brought better crops. It was a theological tug-of-war, with monks on one end and pagan priests on the other. Historians still argue whether the Christianization of Britain was smooth or spiky. The evidence suggests both. In some places, churches went up on former pagan sites. The transition eased by mixing old symbols with new ones. In others, shrines were torn down, and sacred groves burned. Diplomacy one day, axe swinging the next. But while Christianity was spreading, the Britons in the West, those who'd never stopped being Christian, were watching with mixed feelings. On one hand, they shared the faith. On the other, they saw their old lands being divided by people who didn't speak their language and buried their dead with swords instead of psalms. The term Welsh, in fact, comes from the Old English word wheelas, meaning foreigners. An ironic twist given that it was the Anglo-Saxons who were the newcomers. But history isn't always fair with labels. And so, Britain split, not by walls, but by culture. In the West, the Britons, Christian, poetic, clinging to fragments of Rome and dreams of a lost golden age. In the East and South, the Anglo-Saxons, fierce, practical, slowly being drawn into the Christian fold, but reshaping the land in their own image. And in the borderlands between them, tension, skirmishes, trade, the occasional marriage alliance, and lots of arguments over who owned that particular hill with the really good pigs. Britain wasn't united, not even close, but it was evolving. The old had not vanished, it had simply learned to survive. By the early 600s, Britain had become a landscape of many voices, many gods, and many claims to the same muddy fields. The island was no longer Roman, and not yet England. It was a mosaic cracked and reassembled, full of bold shapes, strange gaps, and the occasional surprising bit of gold leaf. But don't picture Northumbria as some peaceful book club with incense. These kings still fought. A lot. With each other, with the Welsh, with their own cousins. One minute, they were dedicating churches, the next, they were chasing each other through forests with axes. Some of those golden flecks were the kingdoms rising in the east. Anglo-Saxon realms like Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex had gone from tribal groups to serious political players, and they weren't just farming and fighting anymore. They were building churches, issuing laws and sending letters to popes. Northumbria, in particular, was having a moment. Under kings like Edwin and Oswald, it transformed from a collection of warrior lords into a genuine Christian kingdom, with monasteries, missions, and a curious new obsession with writing things down. Places like Lindisfarne and Whitby became centers of scholarship and spiritual life. Their monks copied manuscripts, composed music, and accidentally preserved half the early medieval world in illuminated margins, full of peacocks and saints who looked mildly confused. Of course, not everyone welcomed this shift. The Britons in the West still held their own. In places like Gwynedd and Dumnonia, they maintained their languages, traditions, and deeply rooted Christianity. Their bards composed epic poetry in a tongue the Saxons couldn't understand. Their leaders claimed descent from Roman generals, ancient kings, or when feeling bold, Arthur himself. Laws began to be written, actual codes with fines, compensations, and rules about what to do if someone's ox wandered into your mead hall and kicked over the sacred fire. Kings called councils, bishops offered advice, and underneath it all, the idea of belonging to a kingdom, not just a tribe or family, started to emerge. Still, something new was taking root: identity, and they fought back. Not always successfully, but with determination. The border between Briton and Saxon was fluid and bloody, marked by skirmishes, raids, and the occasional very dramatic insult carved into a stone. But the Britons weren't the only ones facing a squeeze. One notable resistance moment came at the Battle of Chester in the early 600s. Saxons pushed west, trying to drive a wedge between the northern and southern Britons. The result was a brutal clash, and while exact details are scarce, it marked another squeeze on the native Brittonic peoples, cutting them off, pushing them into the edges of the island. The spread of Christianity brought with it conflict of a different kind, not swords but sermons. By the mid-600s, Britain had two competing Christian traditions. One, Roman style, orderly, Pope-approved, and fond of well-pressed robes. The other, Celtic, independent, monastic, and deeply connected to Ireland and the western fringes. This tension came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 64 CE, a sort of ecclesiastical bake-off where church leaders debated everything from the correct date of Easter to the preferred style of clerical tonsure. Yes, they argued over haircuts. King Oswy of Northumbria ultimately chose the Roman side, aligning his kingdom with continental Christianity. Historians still argue whether this was a deeply theological decision or just Oswy picking the faction with the better calendar. Either way, it marked a turning point. Roman Christianity, with its hierarchy and connection to wider Europe, gained the upper hand. Celtic traditions didn't vanish, they simply moved west into quieter hills and holier hermitages. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms weren't done growing. They intermarried, traded, occasionally assassinated each other, and built alliances. Some, like Kent, faded. Others, like Mercia, surged. Wessex hovered in the background, biding its time, and all the while, England, though still unformed, was being imagined. Fringe fact: some of the earliest English poetry dates to this time. Works like The Dream of the Rood or Cædmon's Hymn show a society where oral storytelling was merging with Christian themes, where warrior culture was being baptized and rewritten. Jesus was still on the cross, but now he was described like a noble thane, brave, stoic, wrapped in glory, and literacy mattered. Kings kept scribes, monks became bureaucrats, land grants were written down, often with Latin on one side and Old English creeping into the margins. Language was changing. Memory was no longer just oral, it was on parchment illuminated with gold and filed under E for eternal salvation. But not all was stable. Still, something had shifted. Britain was no longer a patchwork of survival stories. It was becoming a land of power blocks, religious centers, and administrative ambition. Roads were being repaired, markets reopened, kings were thinking in terms of policy, not just plunder. Plague swept through in waves, crops failed, factions splintered. The kingship of any given realm was a revolving door of brothers, nephews, and the occasional very surprised third cousin. Stability, when it came, was brief and costly. And yet, there was always the sea. And across that sea, something else was watching. Something hungry, cold, and armed to the teeth. Because while the Britons and Saxons had spent the past 2 centuries fighting over fields and feast halls, another force had been sharpening its axes. The first recorded raid on British soil happened in 1793 CE, when the monastery at Lindisfarne, one of Northumbria's holiest sites, was stormed and looted. Monks were killed, manuscripts burned, and sacred relics scattered into the sea. It wasn't just a physical attack, it was a psychological one. These were God's servants, attacked not by heretics, but by strangers from across the sea, who didn't care about God at all. The Norse were coming. They didn't arrive all at once. There were no warning horns or polite declarations. Just longships, sleek, fast, low in the water, slipping into estuaries, hugging coastlines, and disgorging men with shields, swords, and absolutely no interest in local customs. The Vikings had arrived. Fringe detail. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the raid as coming with immense flashes of lightning and dragons seen in the sky. It was probably just a dramatic thunderstorm, but to people of the time, it felt apocalyptic. A warning from heaven, or maybe, just maybe, a reminder that their carefully rebuilt world could still be broken, and broken it was. Over the next few decades, the Viking threat grew. What started as hit-and-run raids on isolated monasteries soon evolved into full-scale invasions. Longships lined the coasts. Fortified camps sprang up inland. They weren't just looters anymore, they were settlers. Some Anglo-Saxon kings resisted, others tried diplomacy. A few simply paid the Vikings to go away, offering up huge sums in silver. Denegeld, it was called, a kind of medieval protection money, paid in hopes that the wolves wouldn't return. Spoiler, they always returned, and at the heart of Wessex stood Alfred. But the real shift came in the mid-800s, with the arrival of the Great Heathen Army. That's not a poetic term, that's what the Anglo-Saxon sources actually called them. A massive Viking force, likely made up of Danes, Norwegians, and others from Scandinavia, swept into Britain. They weren't here for loot, they were here for land. Led by semi-legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, the Great Army tore through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell, East Anglia followed, Mercia teetered. Only Wessex, tucked in the southwest, full of sheep and very stubborn kings, held the line. The Vikings weren't just raiding, they were occupying. They set up winter camps, demanded tribute, and married into local families. For many Anglo-Saxons, it was hard to tell whether their neighbor was still Saxon or had become something new. Danelaw, that's what the occupied region came to be called. The Danelaw, a swath of eastern and northern England, where Viking rule took hold. It had its own laws, customs, and power structures. You could walk from Essex to York without hearing a word of English or seeing a single crucifix. Alfred the Great didn't start out great. He wasn't even supposed to be king, but through a series of deaths, disasters, and very badly timed illnesses, he found himself on the throne at exactly the moment everything was falling apart. One of his greatest victories came in 8078 at the Battle of Edington, where Alfred's forces defeated the Great Army and forced its leader, Guthrum, to convert to Christianity as part of the peace terms. It wasn't a full reconquest, but it was a moment of survival. Wessex had endured. He didn't just fight, he rebuilt. He reorganized the army, created a network of fortified towns, burhs, and built a navy to counter the Viking ships. He promoted literacy, translated Latin works into Old English, and used religion as a unifying force. Christianity wasn't just a faith, it was a national identity, one that set Wessex apart from the pagan north. So how did Alfred respond? With cunning, of course. Historians still argue just how great Alfred truly was. Some see him as a genius tactician and cultural reformer. Others think the sources written by pro-Alfred monks may have polished his legacy just a tad. Either way, he held the line when everyone else crumbled. That counts for something. After Alfred's death, his descendants continued the work. Edward the Elder and Ethelflad, Lady of the Mercians, pushed the frontier back. They retook towns, reinforced burhs, and negotiated with Viking rulers. Slowly, piece by piece, Anglo-Saxon control expanded. But this wasn't a simple us versus them narrative. Over time, the lines blurred. Some Vikings settled peacefully. They farmed, traded, converted. Norse words slipped into English: sky, egg, knife, window. Names like Thorpe, Grimston, and Scunthorpe dot the map. Linguistic fossils of the Viking Age. Yet, for all this complexity, life was still precarious. Crops failed, plagues returned, and raids, while fewer, never really stopped. Even in the Danelaw, rival Viking factions jostled for power, sometimes turning on each other with spectacularly confusing results. And not all interactions were hostile. Trade flourished. Coins from Baghdad have been found in Yorkshire. Amber from the Baltic turned up in Wessex. Britain was no longer an isolated island. It was part of a northern European network bound together by ships, stories, and silver. Meanwhile, in the shadows of these political shifts, something deeper was stirring. A new idea, one that hadn't existed before. Not just tribes, not just kingdoms, but something larger. A single realm, a united land, England. But amidst the mess, one thing had changed. The idea of unity was no longer laughable. By the early 900s, the map of Britain looked like the leftovers from an epic feast. Here, a chunk of Wessex. There, a gnawed-on bone of Northumbria, half covered in Viking sauce. Across the middle stretched the Danelaw, neither fully Norse nor fully Saxon, but something else entirely. And in the west, the ever-resilient Britons of Wales and Cornwall, still singing, farming, and giving side-eye to absolutely everyone. Not quite yet, but almost. Thanks largely to the dynasty Alfred had launched, Wessex had gone from last hope to first contender. His son, Edward the Elder, wasn't flashy, but he was relentless. He kept building burhs, reclaiming territory, and outmaneuvering enemies who were either too slow, too disorganized, or too hungover from the last feast to stop him. And then there was Ethelflad, daughter of Alfred, Lady of the Mercians, and perhaps the most underrated war leader in early British history. She ruled Mercia after her husband's death, leading armies, fortifying towns, and generally doing everything a king would have done, but with fewer recorded tantrums. Together, Edward and Ethelflad gradually reclaimed English-held territory, rolling back the Danelaw like someone very determined to iron out a crumpled map. By the time Edward's son Aethelstan took the throne in 94, the pieces were nearly in place. Fringe fact: contemporary sources called her Merkena Heftiger, the Lady of the Mercians. Not queen, but something arguably more powerful. She wasn't just married to power, she was power. When she died in 918, even the Vikings paused long enough to say, well, she was kind of terrifying. And Aethelstan, he didn't just pick up where his father and aunt left off, he finished the job. By 927, Aethelstan had conquered Northumbria, forging what many historians now call the first real kingdom of England. He wasn't king of Wessex, or Mercia, or East Anglia. He was king of the English. The whole thing. One of his greatest moments came in 97, at the Battle of Brunanburh. There a grand alliance of Scots, Norse Gaels, and Britons tried to shatter his fragile kingdom. They failed. The battle was brutal, legendary, and so soaked in poetic bragging that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle composed an entire victory hymn about it. Spoiler, it doesn't rhyme, but it absolutely gloats. And not just in name, Aethelstan held court like a continental monarch. He issued national law codes, struck new coinage, and even arranged marriages across Europe, because nothing says power like marrying off your sister to a foreign prince. After Brunanburh, there was no going back. England had emerged, not as a dream or a fragile alliance, but as a political reality. It had boundaries, laws, identity, and crucially, ambition. But let's not get too sentimental. Unity didn't mean peace. Kings still fought, factions still schemed, and the North, especially Yorkshire, was never quite on board with this whole England thing. It remained culturally Norse for generations. Some towns operated under Danish law, some nobles had names like Thorkel and Erik. The Viking past wasn't erased, it was absorbed. Language followed suit. Old English, once a purely Germanic tongue, began picking up Norse words like it was trying on new shoes. They, them, sky, law, knife, all Viking imports. Even the word egg is Scandinavian. You can thank a 10th century Dane for your breakfast. Religion, too, had evolved. Christianity was now fully entrenched, but colored by its chaotic journey through conquest, exile, and quiet resistance. Churches dotted the countryside, monasteries reopened. Bishops began flexing political muscles, sometimes more than the kings they served. And in the countryside, people still plowed their narrow strips of land, worried about the weather, and occasionally muttered old charms in a mix of English, Latin, and whatever dialect the local cattle happened to respond to. The Britons in the West, especially in Wales, kept to their own rhythms. They weren't part of England. Not yet, but they watched its rise with wary eyes. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they made deals, but always they endured. Back in England, Ethelstan's death in 1909 sent tremors through the kingdom. Unity, it turned out, was harder to keep than to create. His successors, Edmund, Edred, Edwig, each faced rebellions, invasions, and the creeping sense that England might unravel before it truly took shape. Scotland, too, was beginning to form, not yet a unified kingdom, but a gathering storm of Picts, Gaels, and Norse settlers who would eventually merge into something formidable. But that's another story. Still, the framework held. The title King of the English didn't fade. The laws remained. The coinage circulated. The idea once sparked proved stubborn. It was a work in progress, a stitched-together patchwork of tribes, traditions, and traumas. A land where Roman roads still ran past Norse graves, where Saxon laws were copied by Christian scribes, where kings feasted in halls that stood atop Iron Age mounds. But identity is a slow burn. In the streets of London, the fields of Kent, the hills of Yorkshire, people didn't suddenly wake up and say, "Ah yes, I am now English." They lived their lives. They wore mixed clothes, spoke mixed dialects, and followed rules from whichever lord shouted the loudest. So what was England, really? It was, in other words, the ghost of everything that came before, wrapped in the ambitions of what came next, and it was only just getting started. England may have finally emerged on the map, but it was a wobbly toddler of a kingdom wide-eyed, ambitious, and prone to falling face first into trouble. No sooner had Ethelstan stitched the land together than his successors had to hold it there with trembling hands and stitched-up swords. The throne wasn't a prize, it was a seat in a bear pit. Edmund A., Ethelstan's brother, inherited the crown in 99. He spent his reign shoring up what had just been unified. Vikings, never the most consistent with treaties, kept poking into Northumbria, and Edmund had to push back first with diplomacy, then with what historians kindly call strategic murdering. He even had to retake the 5 boroughs, key towns like Derby and Leicester, that kept toggling between English and Viking control, like they were playing for both teams. He was followed by his brother Edred, who continued the endless project of pulling Northumbria into the fold. It was like trying to convince a cat to bathe. It might work temporarily, but claws were inevitable. Even so, Edred managed to bring the last Norse king of York to heel and restore nominal control over the north. Edmund didn't reign long. He was stabbed in a scuffle during a feast, possibly by an outlaw, possibly after too much mead. Either way, England learned another important medieval lesson. Never relax during dinner. Fringe detail. Edred suffered from a mysterious illness that left him unable to eat solid food, yet he kept ruling, possibly through sheer spite and a liquid diet. Medieval monarchs, tougher than they looked, but, even as the bureaucracy sharpened its quills, real power still came down to swords and loyalty. And here's where things get messy. As these kings fought and negotiated, the machinery of England began to hum. Law codes multiplied, the church expanded, shires and hundreds units of land administration were enforced more systematically. Monasteries flourished under royal patronage, especially as more nobles sought spiritual insurance after lifetimes of not-so-subtle murder and land grabs. Yes, split the kingdom, again, because apparently no one in early England had heard of healthy sibling boundaries. Eadwig, Edmund's son, took the throne in 955. His reign is remembered mostly for scandal. At his coronation banquet, he allegedly disappeared, only to be found in bed with a noblewoman and her daughter. The Archbishop of Canterbury dragged him back to the feast. This wasn't just gossip, it was a power struggle. Eadwig's enemies used the incident to undermine his rule, and eventually they split the kingdom, giving Mercia and Northumbria to his younger brother Edgar. Eadwig died young, and Edgar the Peaceful took over the whole thing in 959, and surprisingly, he was good at it. His nickname wasn't sarcasm, his reign really was peaceful. No major invasions, no spectacular betrayals, just steady governance, legal reforms, and a strong partnership with the church. Edgar's coronation, held in 973, was a lavish affair. So lavish, in fact, that it became the model for all future English coronations, including the modern ones, right down to the anointing. He even rode down the River Dee with 8 subordinate kings paddling his boat as a symbol of his supremacy. Subtle? No. Effective? Oh, yeah. But Edgar died in 975, and once again, England stumbled. His son Edward, later known as Edward the Martyr, was a teenager and not particularly popular with the nobles. Within a few years, he was assassinated. Stabbed, likely on the orders of his stepmother. His body was dumped, later retrieved, and buried with full royal honors. Cue sainthood and a lifetime of miraculous shrine-based cures. It was during Edgar's reign that England truly began to feel like a functioning state. He standardized coinage, reinforced local law enforcement, and supported monastic reform movements that cleaned up many decaying abbeys. Monks under men like Dunstan, Aethelwald, and Oswald rebuilt religious life with new vigor, discipline, and the occasional terrifying hymn. And then came Ethelred. You may know him as Ethelred the Unready. A mistranslation, by the way. His nickname, Unread, actually meant ill-advised. He wasn't personally indecisive. He just listened to truly awful counsel. The result was chaos. The Vikings returned, not the scruffy raiders of earlier centuries, but well-organized, kingdom-backed forces, led by kings like Swene Forkbeard of Denmark. They launched a series of brutal invasions starting in the 980s. England paid them off with increasingly enormous sums of denegeld taxes raised to buy peace, which, predictably, only encouraged more attacks. In 102, Ethelred made things worse by ordering the St. Brice's Day massacre, the killing of all Danes living in England. It didn't go well. Not only was it impossible to enforce properly, but one of the victims may have been the sister of King Sweyn. Sweyn didn't take it well. He invaded again. Then again. By 1013 he had taken the throne of England. Ethelred fled to Normandy. For a brief moment, England had a Danish king. Sweyn died suddenly, but his son Cnut returned to claim what his father had started. And against all odds, he succeeded. By 1016, Cnut the Great was king of England. Cnut ruled wisely and with surprising grace. He upheld English laws, respected Christian traditions, and married Ethelred's widow, Emma, to legitimize his claim. He blended Anglo-Saxon and Danish customs, rewarding loyal Fenians and bishops alike. For a man who took the throne by conquest, he was remarkably good at keeping the peace. And now, England was part of a northern empire, a Scandinavian one. But Cnut's death in 1035 triggered more instability. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, fought over the throne. The old Anglo-Saxon line, waiting patiently in Normandy, saw an opportunity. Edward ruled peacefully, if not dynamically. He was more monk than monarch. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey, left much of the kingdom's day-to-day running to powerful earls like Godwin of Wessex, and crucially failed to produce an heir. And so, in 1042, Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred and Emma, returned to England. and reclaimed the crown. Multiple claimants, a divided nobility, foreign eyes watching hungrily, which meant that when he died in 1066, England once again stood at the edge of a knife, and just across the channel, a man named William was preparing his sails. But before that moment, just before the Great Storm, England had become something astonishing, a unified realm, once inconceivable, now very real. And now, for the first time, it was whole. It had risen from ice and bone, from stone circles and crumbling villas. It had been reshaped by faith, fire, and ambition. It's the kind of date you can carve into the side of a mountain. The moment when everything tipped, and the island we now call England fell headfirst into a new era. But before the Norman cavalry charged onto the scene, the country was already a tangle of promises, power plays, and people pretending everything was fine. When Edward the Confessor died in January of that fateful year, he left behind a very neat abbey, a kingdom full of political tension, and most importantly, no heir. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a crisis in slow motion, and everybody saw it coming. Several claimants had quietly begun rehearsing their victory speeches long before the old king's bed went cold. Step forward. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful noble in England, and the man standing closest to the throne when Edward exhaled his last breath. The Witan, the King's Council, acted fast. They crowned Harold within days. But legitimacy, that was still up for grabs. Because over in Normandy, Duke William was sharpening more than his knives. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. Even worse, or better, depending on whose side you're on, he claimed that Harold himself had sworn to support him, possibly under duress, probably while half-dressed, and definitely with one hand on a suspiciously large pile of relics. Meanwhile, up in Norway, King Harald Hardrada had decided that he, in fact, was the rightful king of England, by way of a sketchy inheritance treaty involving a previous Danish king and a deeply questionable memory of events. So, within months, England was facing a three-way grudge match. Harold, William, and Harold, Saxon, Norman, and Norse. A king, a duke, and a Viking, each armed with soldiers, ambition, and wildly different ideas about English consent. Harald Hardrada struck first. In September 1066, he sailed down from Norway with a massive fleet and landed in Yorkshire. Harold Godwinson, fast and furious, marched his army north and met him at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The result? A bloodbath. The Viking force was decimated. Harold was killed. His men, those who survived, limped home in just 24 of the 300 ships they'd arrived in. Fringe detail: the battle took place during an unexpected heatwave. The English army had to march roughly 89.5 miles in just a few days to get there. It's one of the most impressive forced marches in medieval history, and it might explain why they were slightly out of breath when William showed up. Because William wasn't waiting. While Harold was still mopping Viking blood out of his beard, William landed on the south coast with a highly disciplined Norman army, cavalry, archers, siege engineers, and a well-fed clergy ready to document how glorious it all was. Harold had no choice. He turned his exhausted troops around and marched them straight back south. On October 14th, 1066, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Hastings. Either way, the battle was over. England had a new ruler, and then Harold was killed. Not slowly, not dramatically, just gone. Whether he was shot in the eye with an arrow or cut down by Norman knights remains a matter of debate. Historians still argue, and the Bayeux Tapestry, our biggest visual source for the event, is maddeningly vague about whether that's really him getting poked in the eyeball. It wasn't a quick fight. It wasn't even particularly clean. The English held the high ground and used a shield wall, a classic Saxon strategy. The Normans attacked uphill, all day, using waves of cavalry and archers. Several times it looked like the English might hold, but then the tide turned. Some say because the Normans feigned retreat, drawing the Saxons out of formation. Others say it was just endurance. The Saxons had marched too far, fought too many battles, and simply ran out of steam. But conquering England wasn't the same as controlling it. William spent the next few years putting down rebellions. The North rose up. So did the West. Towns were burned. Castles were built. The countryside, especially north of the Humber, was devastated in what came to be called the Harrying of the North, a scorched earth campaign that left entire regions starving and skeletal. This wasn't diplomacy, it was dominance. To seal his hold, William redistributed land on a scale that's hard to overstate. By the 1080s, only a tiny handful of English lords still held their estates. The rest had been replaced by Norman barons, men who owed William everything and were expected to fight for it. England's social hierarchy was completely rewritten. Fringe fact: for centuries after the conquest, England had trilingual bureaucracy: Latin for church and law, French for nobility, and English for absolutely everything else, especially when you stubbed your toe or yelled at your sheep. Language changed too. The upper classes began speaking Norman French. The legal system adopted French terms. The clergy, always happy to upgrade their Latin, joined in. English, once the language of kings, was demoted, spoken by peasants, preserved by poets, and quietly waiting its turn. And yet, the English identity didn't disappear. It shifted, absorbed, adapted. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, once a clear-eyed record of events, grew bitter, then quiet. The monks could tell that something had ended. The old order, born of tribes, tempered by Rome, shaped by Vikings and kings and burrs, was gone. But the people remained. They ploughed the same fields, prayed in the same churches, told the same old stories, now with a Norman accent. Before 1066, England was a dream of unity. And so, with a crown taken in battle and a language taken by law, England truly became England, not just a kingdom, but a conquered one, not just a people, but a blend. After 166, it was a memory remade. The Norman conquest wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a full system reboot, with a very aggressive update schedule. After 1066, England's world shifted on almost every axis: power, language, land, law, architecture. Even what people ate began to reflect the new order. The Normans didn't just conquer England, they redesigned it. Start with land. William the Conqueror wasn't interested in sharing. He redistributed English estates with the efficiency of someone rearranging a chessboard. Over 90% of English land passed into Norman hands within a single generation. The old Anglo-Saxon elite, mostly gone, replaced by Norman barons, many of whom couldn't even pronounce the names of the places they now ruled. Fringe fact: some Norman lords couldn't read English charters and had to ask monks or locals to explain what they'd just inherited. Imagine showing up to your new estate and needing a tour guide to find your own barn. To track this vast land grab, William commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086. It was a nationwide audit, an astonishing survey of who owned what, right down to the number of pigs and beehives. It wasn't about fairness, it was about taxes. If you owned it, the king wanted to know, and more importantly, he wanted to know how much he could squeeze out of it. The legal system changed too. William imposed a new feudal structure. All land technically belonged to the king. Everyone else held it in return for service, usually military. In practice, this meant peasants owed work to knights, knights owed loyalty to barons, and barons owed absolutely everything to William. It was a pyramid scheme made of swords. And then there were castles. These castles weren't just military installations. They were psychological weapons. From their high towers, Norman lords could watch their English subjects, and the English in turn could look up and be reminded who was in charge. Constantly. The Anglo-Saxons hadn't really gone in for castles. A few burhs, some fortified halls, sure, but the Normans, they were obsessed. Within months of the conquest, wooden Motte and Bailey castles sprang up all over the countryside like mushrooms after a thunderstorm. Later, they were rebuilt in stone, great hulking keeps like the Tower of London, shouting across the skyline that the Normans were here, and they had no intention of leaving. Daily life for most people didn't change overnight. Of course, a peasant was still a peasant, whether his lord drank mead or Bordeaux, but things did shift. Tithes and rents increased. Forest laws were imposed, turning vast swaths of countryside into royal hunting grounds, off limits to locals under penalty of mutilation or death. Even collecting firewood could now be a criminal act. William replaced nearly every English bishop with a Norman. The church became deeply tied to royal authority, and massive new cathedrals began to rise. Winchester, Durham, Canterbury, built in the Romanesque style, all soaring arches and thick walls. They weren't just church, they were statements. And religion, that too was transformed. But for all the brutality of the conquest, something strange happened over time. The two worlds, Anglo-Saxon and Norman, began to blur. The Normans spoke French, the English spoke Old English. Within a century, they were speaking something in between. The English language absorbed thousands of French words, especially in law, cuisine, art, and administration. That's why today, we dine on beef, from the French birth, but raise cows from the Old English que. The people who worked the land spoke English. The people who ruled it spoke French. Eventually, they all just made it up as they went. Over time, the distinction between Norman and English began to fade. By the 12th century, most English nobles were technically Norman, but culturally something new, and the monarchy itself became a kind of hybrid. Historians still argue whether the Normans were cultural tyrants or accidental collaborators. Truth is, they were both. They crushed resistance, but they also married into English families. They suppressed native customs, but preserved key institutions like shire courts and the writ system. They mocked English poetry, then started commissioning it. William was succeeded by his son, William Rufus, who reigned with flamboyance, ruthlessness, and possibly a closet full of velvet. He died in a mysterious hunting accident in the New Forest, probably shot by an arrow, possibly by someone with a very clear sense of ambition. Next came Henry I, smooth, calculating, and a master of administration. He issued the Charter of Liberties, an early attempt to rein in royal excess and curry favor with the nobles. It didn't exactly usher in democracy, but it was a nod to the idea that kings might have limits. Sometimes, and all this time, the English people were watching. Remembering, by the early 1100s, England had become something unique, no longer Saxon, not fully Norman, but deeply shaped by both. It was a kingdom built on contradiction, a land of old languages and new rulers, Roman roads and French castles, Viking law and Christian prayer. The myths shifted too. Old heroes like Beowulf gave way to new ones. Arthur returned, now reimagined as a Christian king fighting for a united land. The Norman chroniclers, eager to connect with their adopted home, picked up the tale and ran with it. Arthur was no longer a relic of resistance. He was a symbol of what England could be, and it was restless, because conquest doesn't just take land, it leaves a mark on minds, on stories, on the very shape of villages. People remembered what was lost, they whispered about it, sang about it, dreamed of a time before the Normans, even as they learned to live under them. England had survived invasion after invasion. It had worn Roman robes, Saxon mail, Viking fur, and now, Norman silk. It had been ruled from Rome, Wessex, Denmark, and Normandy. But it had never broken, and somewhere, beneath all that feudal structure and French pageantry, the idea of England, the real England, kept simmering, waiting. By the time the 12th century unfolded, England was less a conquered nation and more a strange fusion creature, part Viking mutterings, part Saxon stubbornness, and part Norman swagger, held together with sheep taxes and the occasional rebellion. It looked like a kingdom, it functioned like a kingdom. But underneath the polished stone cathedrals and well-stamped royal charters, the soil still remembered who used to walk it. It began with Henry II, who took the throne in 1154, son of the fiery and occasionally explosive Empress Matilda and the fiercely ambitious Geoffrey of Anjou. Henry inherited not just England, but a sprawl of territories across France, Anjou, Normandy, Maine, and, through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he picked up Gascony, Poitou, and a hefty portion of southwestern France. Enter the Angevin Empire. If that sounds like something from a fantasy novel, you're not far off. And yet, something remarkable was happening. For the first time, the English crown had eyes far beyond England itself. The result? a king who ruled more of France than the actual king of France. Fringe fact: Henry's system laid the foundation for English common law, one of England's most enduring exports, alongside roast dinners and passive-aggressive queuing. Henry wasn't just a landholder, though. He was a reformer. He reorganized the English legal system, creating royal justices who traveled the kingdom, applying common law. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a revolution. For the first time, justice wasn't just what your local lord said it was. It came from the king himself, written down, applied uniformly. Well, mostly. But Henry had a temper, and one of the people who tested it most famously was Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. At first, they were friends. Henry thought he'd found a loyal churchman who'd help him bring the clergy under royal control. Instead, Becket grew a backbone, defied the king, and became a thorn in his side. It all escalated into a fatal misunderstanding. In 1170, Henry allegedly muttered something along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took that as a royal to-do list, rode to Canterbury, and murdered Becket at the altar. The shock was enormous. Becket became a martyr, the king was forced into public penance, and Canterbury turned into one of Europe's top pilgrimage sites. Yes, that Canterbury, the one Chalker's characters will eventually complain about walking to. Meanwhile, Henry's vast empire began to wobble. Holding England and half of France together was like juggling cats. Angry, sword-wielding cats, with legal claims. His own sons rebelled against him. Repeatedly, because of course they did. One of those sons was Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, a warrior king with more charisma than interest in actual administration. Richard spent most of his reign either on crusade or in captivity. He spoke French, not English. He saw England more as a bank account than a homeland. But still, the legend grew. Richard the Brave, the Just, the Lion-Hearted, who in reality treated England like a debit card with a coastline. He died in 1199, shot with a crossbow while besieging a tiny castle. Yes, the mighty Crusader king died fighting a rebellious teenage noble over some treasure. History has no chill. After Richard came John, and if you've ever heard of bad kings, you've heard of John. Treacherous, petty, suspicious, and possibly allergic to competence. He lost most of the French lands his father had amassed, taxed his nobles into open revolt, and clashed with the Pope so hard that England got excommunicated. But even terrible kings can accidentally make history. In 1215, after pushing the barons too far, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a charter of rights and limitations that, while immediately broken, planted the seeds for constitutional government. No, it didn't create democracy, but it did create a precedent that even kings were not above the law. That idea would echo through English history like a very determined monk banging on a church door. Because now, England wasn't just a land of kings and battles, it was a kingdom with memory. John died in 1216, mid-Civil War, leaving the throne to his son Henry III, who was 9 years old and probably more into wooden swords than charters. But the kingdom survived barely, and the barons, bishops and bureaucrats kept things moving. Memory of conquest, of lost lands, of saints martyred, of laws written and oaths broken. And more importantly, it was a kingdom with a people, increasingly thinking of themselves as English, regardless of whether their ancestors came with Caesar, Hengist, Canute, or William. Even the language was shifting. Old English, battered and bruised by centuries of invasion, had begun to evolve. It absorbed French vocabulary, adopted new syntax, and by the late 12th century, started to look like something you might understand if you squinted. English wasn't just surviving, it was transforming. It was still a monarchy, still a feudal society, but something was different now. Kings had limits, towns had rights, and somewhere in the dusty corners of monasteries and marketplaces, the first whispers of what it meant to be English, not just a subject, but a culture, began to form. Meanwhile, towns were growing, trade flourished, guilds emerged, cathedrals rose. The Black Death was still a century away, but the pressure was building. England was becoming crowded, literate, litigious, and just a little bit self-aware. England was no longer just land. It was an idea, and that idea, tested by empires and sharpened by failure, was about to face its next challenge. Not from invaders, but from itself. By the 13th century, England had grown too large, too loud, and far too complicated for any one person to control cleanly. Not that kings ever stopped trying. Power wasn't just about swords anymore, it was about documents, councils, and very tense meetings in chilly stone halls. Henry III ruled for over 50 years, but his reign was a masterclass in how to alienate everyone. He built lavishly, Westminster Abbey, got a full royal makeover, but governed poorly. He overspent, meddled in European affairs, and surrounded himself with unpopular foreign favourites. The English barons, already nursing the hangover of John's reign, were not amused. Eventually, Henry's policies sparked a full-scale rebellion led by Simon de Montfort, a charismatic noble with excellent hair and very ambitious ideas about governance. In 1265, de Montfort summoned a gathering that would later be romanticized as England's first parliament. Now, don't picture a polished green chamber with microphones. This was more like a glorified emergency meeting, with knights and burgesses awkwardly trying to represent the common people, while also wondering how to keep their boots dry. Still, it mattered. The idea had been planted. Kings could be challenged, and councils could include voices beyond the nobility. De Montfort was eventually killed in battle, and Henry clawed back control, but the principle, it stuck. His son, Edward I, learned a few things from all this drama, mostly how not to lose power. Edward was a formidable king, tall, driven, and extremely fond of conquest. He earned the nickname Hammer of the Scots, though he also spent considerable energy hammering the Welsh. And then, of course, came Scotland. Edward invaded Wales in the late 13th century, defeating local rulers and building a network of imposing stone castles. Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, monuments not just to military might, but to royal paranoia. He gave his son the title Prince of Wales, a tradition that continues to this day, mostly just to irritate actual Welsh people. Edward died in 1307, en route to yet another campaign in Scotland, reportedly demanding his bones be carried into battle. They weren't. His son, Edward II, had other problems. Edward II was not like his father. He preferred music to war, friendship to politics, and depending on which chronicler you believe, had a romantic relationship with his favourite, Piers Gaveston. The barons were scandalised, so was his wife, Isabella of France, who eventually invaded England with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and deposed him. Edward was imprisoned and later died in captivity under mysterious and extremely debated circumstances. Edward claimed overlordship of Scotland after its king died without a clear heir. What followed was years of warfare, rebellion, and very dramatic poetry. Enter William Wallace, the towering outlaw who led a ferocious resistance and was later executed in London, with the kind of cruelty medieval chroniclers loved to describe in detail. But we'll skip here, because sweet dreams and all that. Why? Because the French crown said Edward couldn't be king of France, even though his mother had been a French princess. England and France had already been tussling for centuries, but now it became officially epic. The war wasn't one long battle, it was a series of campaigns, truces and diplomatic breakdowns spread across 5 generations. Yes, 5. Historians still argue whether the infamous red-hot poker story is a brutal fact or a medieval smear campaign, but either way, Edward's downfall was spectacular. His son, Edward III, took the throne in 1327 and immediately went about repairing royal prestige. He started by executing Mortimer and ignoring Isabella. Then he started a little thing you may have heard of, the 100 Years' War. In 1346, Edward III scored a major victory at the Battle of Crécy, where English longbowmen, armed with cheap weapons and excellent aim, decimated French knights. It wasn't just a military triumph, it was a cultural one. The longbow became a symbol of English identity, gritty, underdog, and very, very pointy. The same era saw the rise of the Black Prince, Edward's son and one of the most famous knights in English history. He wore black armor, won battles like Poitiers, and generally acted like someone who expected to be king. But he died before his father, passing the claim to his own son, Richard II. Meanwhile, back home, something horrific was sweeping the land. In 1348, the Black Death arrived.
Fringe fact. So many clergy died administering last rites that the church ran out of trained priests and started ordaining teenagers. Not exactly a comforting upgrade during a pandemic. It killed on average 1 in 3 people. Villages vanished. Entire families died within days. The plague was relentless, so fast and brutal that people started digging mass graves before the sick had even died. And yet, the plague brought unexpected change. With so many dead, laborers could demand higher wages. Serfs, those legally tied to the land, began to move. The rigid social order cracked. It didn't collapse, but it bent. When the government tried to fix wages through legislation, people didn't just grumble, they revolted. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt erupted, led by Wat Tyler and fueled by anger over taxes, inequality, and the general sense that the elite weren't paying their share. Sound familiar? Rebels marched on London, burned palaces, and even met with the boy king Richard II, who tricked them with promises before brutally suppressing the movement. But something had changed. For the first time in a very long time, the English lower classes had acted, not just as victims, but as agents. They'd organized, marched, demanded, and even though they lost, their voice echoed. And all of it, the law, the war, the plague, the poetry, was shaping the future. Because even though England still wasn't quite modern, it had something no other kingdom quite managed, a deeply fractured, beautifully strange, fiercely remembered past. By the end of the 14th century, England wasn't just a kingdom of nobles, clergy and peasants. It was a land of merchants, poets, rebels, lawyers, scholars and yes, still many peasants, but peasants with slightly more opinions than before. And right at the heart of this brewing chaos was the House of Lancaster, and it still hadn't seen its biggest shake-up. By the early 1400s, England was standing upright again, but with a slight limp. The Black Death had rewired society. The 100 Years' War dragged on like an uncle's story at Christmas dinner, and royal succession was starting to look more like a game of musical chairs with swords. Fringe fact: Henry I suffered from a mysterious skin condition that left him periodically bedridden. Some thought it was leprosy. Others blamed divine punishment. Either way, he aged like an overused boot. It began with Henry I, who deposed his cousin Richard II in 1399. That wasn't technically allowed, but Henry made up for it by looking incredibly serious in all his portraits. His reign was a patchwork of rebellions and political paranoia, made worse by the fact that he ruled a kingdom still recovering from plague, inflation, and a mild obsession with astrology. His son, Henry V, was a different story. Henry's victory was immortalized by Shakespeare, who may have exaggerated some of the heroics but absolutely nailed the mood. "We few, we happy few," became shorthand for English grit. The battle also gave Henry a temporary upper hand in France. He married the French princess, secured a claim to the throne, and looked poised to unite the two kingdoms under one crown. Tall, dashing, and fluent in war, Henry V is best remembered for the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where a vastly outnumbered English army defeated the flower of French chivalry in ankle-deep mud. Longbows again did the heavy lifting, and the French knights stuck in the muck and shot like very fancy porcupines never stood a chance. Then he died. Of dysentery. Because medieval warfare always has the last laugh. His son Henry VI inherited the crown as an infant, and that's where things start to wobble again. Henry VI was a gentle, pious man who loved books, peace, and praying, which made him uniquely unsuited to ruling a war-torn kingdom with a collapsing economy and nobles who solved problems with axes. England started losing ground in France. The once mighty holdings established under Henry V crumbled, and by the 1450s English forces were being booted out of French territories one by one. The 100 Years' War ended not with a bang, but with a sigh and a very expensive shipping bill. Back at home, the economy was under pressure, the court was divided, and Henry suffered from recurring bouts of catatonic illness. At one point, he didn't speak or move for over a year. He literally sat out part of his own kingship. Picture two branches of the royal family: Lancaster, Red Rose, and York, White Rose.
eyeing each other across a long table, each convinced they had the better claim to the throne. Add in decades of bad blood, fragile egos, and a lot of bored knights with time on their hands, and you get one of the messiest civil wars in English history. And that's when the Wars of the Roses kicked off. It wasn't just a war, it was a series of intermittent, awkward, and extremely bloody chess moves. Kings were crowned, deposed, restored, and sometimes murdered with alarming regularity. Edward I, a Yorkist, took the throne in 1461. He was charismatic, battle-hardened, and tall enough to be described in chronicles as handsome in every aspect. He ruled well, lost the crown, regained it, and ruled again, because consistency is for cowards. He died in 1483, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son, Edward I. But Edward I never ruled. Why? Because of his uncle, Richard III. Fringe tidbit. In 1674, two small skeletons were found buried under a staircase in the Tower. They were reburied in Westminster Abbey as the Lost Princes, but modern scholars are still debating whether they were really Edward V and his brother, or just some very unfortunate houseguests. Richard claimed that his nephews were illegitimate and locked them in the Tower of London. The two princes were never seen again. Historians still argue whether Richard had them killed or whether they were removed to safety and died later. The Tower legend stuck, and stuck hard. Regardless, Richard III took the throne in 1483 and ruled for just 2 years. Then came Bosworth Field. Richard fought bravely, even reportedly charging into battle screaming treason, as he realized some of his allies were switching sides mid-fight. He was killed, and his body was thrown over a horse like old laundry. For centuries, his grave was lost, until 2012, when his skeleton was famously found beneath a Leicester car park. A king of England, buried beneath a parking bay. History really does have a sense of humor. And who won Bosworth? He was distantly related to the Lancastrian line, had spent most of his life in exile, and had just enough noble blood to claim the throne without too many eyebrows being raised. He became Henry VII, married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, and founded the Tudor dynasty, Henry Tudor. The Tudors would go on to dominate the next century of English life, but already something important had happened. England had clawed its way through plague, civil war, and dynastic collapse. And in the process, the idea of monarchy had shifted. The Wars of the Roses ended not with peace talks or treaties, but with a marriage and some very careful PR. No longer divine and untouchable, kings now had to balance tradition with public opinion, legal precedent, and most importantly, survival. The people, too, were changing. Parliament, once a gathering of nobles and knights, had grown into a permanent fixture. Towns were richer, merchants were louder. Even the common folk, once voiceless, had begun to murmur. And the language, fully transformed. Old English was gone, Middle English had matured. The stage was set for a playwright from Stratford to start scribbling, and for printing presses to start pumping. England wasn't just a kingdom now. It was a nation, and it was ready to explode. By the time the Tudors settled into power, England had stopped behaving like a battered kingdom and started acting like an emerging superpower. That's not to say everything was suddenly orderly, far from it. But there was a new swagger in the air. The wars were over. The throne was stable, and the new king had plans. Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, was cautious, calculated, and quietly terrifying. He didn't storm into power. He crept in, consolidated, and then sealed the doors behind him. He married Elizabeth of York to symbolically end the Wars of the Roses, blended the two rival houses into one red and white Tudor rose, and promptly started micromanaging England like a suspicious landlord. He didn't trust the nobility, so he cut them off at the knees. Literally, if needed, through bonds, fines, and a network of spies. Henry reduced the great barons to nervous tenants, and bolstered the middle class and yeomanry. His court was frugal, his tax system efficient, and his personal vault overflowing. Fringe fact: Henry VII left behind one of the largest royal fortunes in English history. He also left behind the look of a man who'd definitely keep receipts for 12 years, just in case. Then came his son, Henry VIII. You've heard of him. Everyone has. Mostly for the wives. 6 of them. 2 divorced, 2 beheaded, 1 died, 1 survived. But before he became the tabloid headline of kings, Henry was seen as a golden prince, handsome, athletic, well-educated, and absolutely determined to be the equal of any European monarch. At first, he tried to win glory through war. He invaded France again, built up the navy, and spent a fortune on cannonballs and Italian armor. But the real impact of his reign came not from the battlefield, but from the altar. And that's when Henry blew the whole system apart. In the 1530s, he broke from the Catholic Church and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. The English Reformation wasn't just a religious event, it was a seismic shift in power, land, and identity. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth confiscated, ancient abbeys were stripped for lead, their lands sold to noble families, who suddenly found themselves very rich indeed. See, Henry wanted a male heir. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him a daughter, Mary, but no sons who lived. So Henry decided to divorce her. The Pope said no. The map of England changed. Literally, villages lost their monks, towns gained new landlords, old pilgrimages vanished, and in their place, a swelling sense of nationalism and state control. Fringe detail: the Bible, once a Latin-only affair, was now printed in English, thanks to translators like William Tyndale, who was executed abroad, but whose words echoed in every church pew for generations. Henry's reign was also the dawn of a truly modern propaganda machine. Portraits by Hans Holbein depicted him as a godlike figure, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, and squinting slightly like someone about to tell you that your taxes are going up. This was a man who made monarchy feel big again, but his personal life? A hot mess. After Catherine, he married Anne Boleyn, who gave birth to Elizabeth, but failed to provide a son. She was executed. Then came Jane Seymour, who finally bore him a son, Edward VI, but died shortly after. Henry married 3 more times, mostly for diplomacy or companionship. None of the later wives made quite the same impact, except as trivia night favorites. By the time he died in 1547, Henry VIII had transformed England. He left behind a restructured church, a beefed-up navy, and a kingdom bristling with possibility and tension. His son Edward VI, just 9 years old, inherited the throne. Edward was a Protestant reformer at heart, more bookish than bellicose. Under his short reign, England leaned further into Protestantism. Church interiors were stripped bare. Latin was booted out entirely, and anyone longing for a return to the old faith was labelled suspect. But Edward died young, in 1553, enter Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and a devout Catholic. Mary tried to undo the Reformation. She restored papal authority, reintroduced Latin Mass, and married the Spanish Prince Philip, who was as charismatic as a damp sponge. Her efforts to roll back Protestantism earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Thanks to a brutal campaign of executions, over 280 burned at the stake, including Archbishop Cranmer, the man who'd helped annul her parents' marriage. Fringe fact: Mary's reign also suffered from crop failures, economic instability, and phantom pregnancies. Public expectations of an heir that never arrived. Her rule was short, tragic, and deeply unpopular by the end. And so came Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter. Elizabeth inherited a country divided by faith, surrounded by hostile powers, and slightly exhausted by drama. She responded by becoming one of the most charismatic and cunning rulers in European history. Meanwhile, English culture blossomed. This was the age of Shakespeare, Marlowe, Francis Drake, and Walter Raleigh. Colonies were planted, tobacco was smoked, theatre-goers wept over tragedies in English, not Latin. She dodged plots, danced through diplomacy, and oversaw the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, a miraculous victory for the smaller, nimbler English fleet that helped forge national pride and marked the beginning of England's emergence as a naval power. She never married, possibly to maintain power, possibly because the options were terrible. Instead, she cultivated an image of the Virgin Queen, married only to her people. Her reign became known as the Elizabethan era, a golden age of exploration, literature, and cautious stability. But Elizabeth's reign wasn't without shadows. Poverty remained widespread. The secret police under Francis Walsingham operated with ruthless efficiency, and while she claimed religious tolerance, Catholics were persecuted, and dissent wasn't exactly welcomed. And just like that, the Tudor dynasty ended. Still, when she died in 1603, Elizabeth left behind a nation transformed, Protestant, literate, increasingly urban, and bursting with ambition. No sons, no cousins, ready to take the throne. There were no Tudors left, but a distant relative in Scotland, a man descended from Henry VII's eldest daughter, was ready. When Queen Elizabeth I died childless in 1603, it marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, but the throne didn't stay empty for long. Enter James VI of Scotland, now James I of England. A single man, a double crown, and about 400 miles of cultural confusion between his two kingdoms. And he was about to unite two crowns, whether England liked it or not. His name was James. Fringe fact: James had been King of Scotland since he was a toddler, survived numerous assassination attempts, and grew up believing God had personally assigned him to rule. That kind of upbringing doesn't make for a humble personality. James believed in absolute monarchy, that kings were God's lieutenants on earth. Parliament to him was a helpful accessory, like a sword or a hat. This did not go down well with English MPs, who had grown used to the idea that the king should, at the very least, pretend to listen. This was the union of the crowns, but not yet a united country. England and Scotland remained separate nations with different laws, churches, and currencies, but now they shared a king with a very strong opinion about divine right, and a very suspicious accent, if you were an English courtier who thought your ruffled collar made you superior. Still, James had his moments. He sponsored the King James Bible, published in 1611, one of the most influential English texts ever written. Its phrases still echo in modern speech. By the skin of your teeth, the powers that be, and fight the good fight. Not bad for a royal vanity project. James also dabbled in foreign policy, literary patronage, and writing about tobacco. He hated it. But he largely avoided the deeper crises bubbling under the surface: religious tension, growing Puritan discontent, and an increasingly assertive parliament. But politics were tense. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 saw a group of Catholic conspirators, including the now infamous Guy Fawkes, attempt to blow up the king and parliament. They failed spectacularly and were tortured, executed, and immortalized in fireworks and terrifying masks. Charles inherited his father's belief in divine right, but without his father's talent for flattery. He married a Catholic French princess, ruled without parliament for 11 years, and imposed taxes so creative they made sheriffs blush. One of them, ship money, was meant for coastal defense. Charles decided everyone inland should pay it too, just in case they ever saw the sea. Then came Charles I, James's son, who managed to turn a long simmering disagreement between monarch and parliament into a full-blown national meltdown. Tensions exploded in the 1640s. Religious disputes, tax grievances, and general fed-upness led to the unthinkable Civil War. Royalists, Cavaliers, fought for the king. Parliamentarians, Roundheads, fought for, well, Parliament, and also for ideas of representation, accountability, and not being bossed around by a man with a feathered hat and trust issues.